Chapter 618. Due to the collapse of the sky, it was replaced by darkness. That darkness was endless, and no one knew how far it stretched. Neither did they know just how big it was. Its existence was like a ghastly mouth that wanted to devour everything. At that moment, the 8th layer of Heaven Gate was within its reach. Perhaps very soon, perhaps at any moment, this place would be reduced to darkness. At that moment, distortions suddenly appeared in the darkness above them. A gigantic crack appeared in the darkness, and low roars came from within. Su Ming also saw Bai Su within the crack. Bai Su's body was covered in blood. There were countless corpses before her, and at that moment, 2 giants were closing in on her with cruel roars. A broken smile appeared on her beautiful face, and the scars on her face looked even more ghastly as they were dyed in blood. Behind her, the old man's face was pale. At that moment, he opened his eyes and looked at Bai Su's back. Grief appeared in his eyes. The 2 giants were already several dozens of feet away from her, but Bai Su's calm expression was a stark contrast to the despair in her eyes. She seemed to be in a slight daze, as if she had thought of something right before her death. A smile appeared on her face, and she closed her eyes. Due to the sound coming from the crack in the sky, it looked like a tunnel that allowed people to step inside. This was Sima Xian's doing. He had opened the tunnel so that Su Ming could see Bai Su in danger. As long as Su Ming went to save her, then he would have a chance to catch his breath. If Su Ming did not, he believed that Su Ming would definitely save her. In silence, Su Ming rammed his fist into Sima Xian's body. Once his body crumbled once again, he sighed and put away Destiny's incarnation. With the span of a few breaths remaining, he took a step towards the sky. At the instant he took a step forward, his body returned to its original state. He stepped into the crack in the sky and appeared in the world filled with gray corpses. The instant he appeared, Bai Su closed her eyes, and the 2 giants around her swung their fists at her with a roar. Killing intent shone in Su Ming's eyes, and he disappeared in an instant. Bai Su closed her eyes. She no longer thought about life and death, no longer thought about anything else. Instead, she focused on her memories and the happiness she had when she was in the 9th summit. She was very, very tired. During these 20 years, she had regretted her actions time and time again. She regretted not cherishing that chance. However, it was all in the past, and she could not change it. Time and time again, she had fantasized that if the heavens could give her another chance to start over, she would definitely cherish it. Definitely death did not come. The shrill screams and the monstrous roars that reverberated in her ears interrupted Bai Su's immersion in her memories. She subconsciously opened her eyes, and when she opened them, she could no longer close them. She saw a figure standing in front of her. It was a familiar figure, a figure that seemed to be carved into his bones. The 2 incoming giants were now falling apart, screaming miserably as they were pulverized into powder. Purple light surrounded her and turned into a ring-shaped impact that swept through the area. Wherever it passed, all the gray corpses that came close to it would shatter into pieces. Su Ming! Bai Su was stunned. She could not believe her own eyes. When Su Ming turned around and looked towards her, tears fell from her eyes. Her mind was blank. At that moment, it was as if the entire world had disappeared, and the person before her was the only thing that existed. The old man also saw Su Ming. He stared at him blankly with disbelief in his eyes. He knew Su Ming, so there was no way he would not know this disciple of the 9th summit who had caused his daughter to sink into pain all those years ago. This Su Ming, who had once wanted to kill him, had turned into a Sai because of Bai Su, and the impact he brought to him now was not any weaker than when Sima Xian had returned. Su Ming. The instant Su Ming turned his head around and looked towards Bai Su, she cried and rushed forward to hug him, as if she was afraid that he would disappear. Su Ming's body froze, then gradually softened. He looked at the crying Bai Su in his arms, and the memories of the past surfaced in his mind, but eventually they were fixed on the scene of his heart changing in the snow, and it turned into a sigh that belonged to someone who had no idea how many years had passed. Yet at that moment, this place did not allow Su Ming to think too much. He hugged Bai Su, and his gaze fell on the old man who was looking at him with a complicated expression on his face. With a wave of his arm, he swept up the old man and brought Bai Su towards the crack he had come from in the sky. At that moment, the crack was rapidly shrinking. Time had passed since Su Ming arrived until he left, but even so, there was only a small part of the crack left. Clearly, Sima Xian did not want Su Ming to come out. Roars came from the ground, and in the distance, there were nearly 100 giants that looked the same. They were taking huge strides towards them, and Su Ming had noticed their appearances a while ago. They were incredibly similar to the giants from the Dead Sea. As the ground trembled, a gigantic crack appeared, as if Su Ming's arrival had attracted the attention of a large number of powerful living beings in the area. Almost at the instant Su Ming brought Bai Su and his father to the crack that was about to close up, a roar that made Su Ming's heart tremble came from the ground. A roar that caused Su Ming's heart to tremble violently once he heard it came from the ground. With just a glance, he saw a crack crawling out of the gigantic crack on the ground. A yellow dragon. That dragon might be a dragon, but it did not look like a crimson dragon. The part of its body that was above the ground was about 10,000 feet long. It did not have any dragon whiskers. Instead, there were fins formed by sharp spikes on its cheeks, and they covered a length of several thousands of feet. Its entire body was a yellowish-brown, and there were many scales on it. That dragon lifted its head and roared. Its voice shook the sky, and at the same time, its body looked incredibly real. It was not an illusion, but a real dragon. That dragon stretched out its hand and pressed it against the ground. As the ground trembled, it lifted its head and sniffed a few times, as if it had smelled something that made it go mad. Its eyes swiftly turned towards Su Ming, and with a loud roar, it rushed out madly towards him. The powerful pressure coming from the dragon made Su Ming feel as if he was looking at the candle dragon when he was still weak. When the dragon's pressure descended on Su Ming's body, the sleeping crimson dragon on Su Ming's arm opened its eyes swiftly. At the instant it opened its eyes, it flew out from Su Ming's arm and turned into a crimson dragon of 10,000 feet in midair. It should not have woken up since it had fallen into a deep slumber, but it was stimulated by the presence of its own kind, and it started roaring at the yellow dragon. Let him go. As the two dragons roared at each other, the crack in front of Su Ming rapidly shrank, but due to the mighty pressure that far surpassed his level of cultivation descending on him, he found himself unable to move. At that moment, a woman's voice came from the ground. The instant that voice rang out, the yellow dragon no longer roared. Instead, it glared at Su Ming. When its roars disappeared, the pressure on Su Ming's body disappeared. He lowered his head and cast a glance at the ground. Without any hesitation, he brought the pail by Su and her father towards a crack. The crimson dragon also turned into a ray of red light and flew out with Su Ming. Once Su Ming left, the crack swiftly closed up and disappeared without a trace. A woman floated out slowly from the crack on the ground. She looked to be in her 20s, but there was an ancient look in her eyes. She was incredibly beautiful, and it was enough to make the world lose its color and make all living beings pale in comparison to her. This sort of beauty was rare in the world. Perhaps it could be said that it should not exist. She floated up and slowly stood on the yellow dragon's back. She looked at the sky with her spirited eyes, and a frown gradually appeared on her face. Why does he have the presence of the Emperor of Abyss, True World, and the Abyss Builders on him? The woman thought about it for a moment before she suddenly laughed. Her laughter caused the world to instantly lose all its color. It's pretty interesting. The dimensional crack in True Morning Dao World leads to Death region. Since we finally come out of our home, Xiao Huang, let's go and take a look at Death region. The woman placed her hands behind her back, and there was a noble presence in her smile. The dragon called Xiao Huang blinked and let out a few low growls at the woman. You said that he has a presence that you hate? Then we have to go and take a look. The woman crouched down and touched the yellow dragon's head. A satisfied expression appeared on the dragon's face, and with a single move, it charged into the sky with the woman in tow. In an instant, They fused into the air and disappeared without a trace. Abyss Builders. This is an incredibly mysterious and rare race, even in the Emperor of Abyss True World. It's rumored that they've already made their decision. The woman mumbled, and an interested look appeared in her eyes. She moved with the yellow dragon and headed towards Death region. Su Ming walked out of the space devoured by darkness in the 8th layer of Heaven Gate. At the instant he walked out, the 8th layer of Heaven Gate completely shattered with a bang. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and without a hint of hesitation, he brought Bai Su and her father towards the 7th layer. Sima Xian was no longer here, but Su Ming believed that he would definitely not leave. His desire to kill Su Ming was as strong as Su Ming's desire to kill him. As the 8th layer shattered, the entire fragment space where the Heavenly Gate was located began to shake violently. The sealed exit was also forcibly opened due to the shaking. Su Ming charged forward, moving through the 7th layer, the 6th layer, and the other layers. Behind him, the darkness continued devouring everything and destroying everything. By the looks of it, it seemed as if it wanted to completely devour the dimension in which Heaven Gate was located. Long arcs charged forward behind Su Ming. These were the people who remained in the few layers of Heaven Gate. At that moment, only by following Su Ming would they be able to survive. It was especially so now that the exit had been opened due to the tremors, making it possible for them to leave this place. When Su Ming rushed into the 1st layer, he cast a glance at the opened rune, then swept up the body of the old man in white who had asked him for help previously and charged towards the exit. Begging for monthly votes. Begging for recommendation votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to cast recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 619. In the car. I will reach home after midnight. This way, riding during the day will not affect me. Although it is tiring, it is worth it. Begging for recommendation votes. Begging for monthly votes. Begging for recognition. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 620. When Su Ming stepped into the rune and disappeared, the collapse of Heaven Gate spread out furiously. Behind Su Ming, the survivors from the various layers of the tribe who had obtained freedom and could leave this place charged forward with Su Ming. Once they stepped into the opened rune, they disappeared. When Su Ming appeared, the surface of the sea beyond the 9th summit tumbled about and turned into a gigantic whirlpool. That whirlpool let out loud, rumbling sounds and turned into a violent gust of wind that could sweep through the sky and earth. The 9th summit was in a precarious situation due to the raging waves in the whirlpool, as if it was about to be submerged at any moment. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. With one move, he charged towards the 9th summit. In the blink of an eye, he closed in on Bai Su and her father, as well as the old man in white from Heaven Gate. Then he lifted his right foot and stomped on the ground of the 9th summit. The instant he did so, a powerful tremor traveled from Su Ming's body to the entire 9th summit and into the seawater around it. A violent boom that sounded like thunder traveled forth, and the seawater around the 9th summit exploded and tumbled backwards, causing a gigantic pit to form on the surface of the sea with the 9th summit as its center. Waves rose into the air at the edges of the pit, and from the distance, it was a terrifying sight to behold. It was as if a gigantic hand had pressed down on the sea and formed a deep pit. When the pit was formed, the 9th summit protruded out of the seawater. When the part of the mountain that was several thousands of feet above the surface of the sea appeared, Su Ming lifted his right hand, formed a seal, and pushed his palm down on the ground. At the same time, Su Ming's hair danced in the wind. His expression was calm, but a glint appeared in his eyes. As he pressed his right hand on the ground, a layer of golden light erupted from his body and spread outward from his right hand, as if it was spreading outwards. In an instant, it covered the entire 9th summit like a screen of light, protecting it within. It was also at that moment that the depression formed by the seawater that Su Ming had since spreading away rapidly recovered. As it recovered, the golden screen of light flashed, causing the ninth summit to stand tall in the midst of the raging waves and violent gusts of wind. Su Ming stood on the ninth summit, right outside Hu Zi's cave abode, who was still snoring loudly. Behind him, Bai Su and her father had just gone through the scene of Heaven Gate crumbling. As their hearts trembled in shock, they gained a deeper understanding towards Su Ming's power. It was especially so for Bai Su's father. As he looked at Su Ming's back, his face was filled with disbelief. At that moment, Su Ming did not hesitate. He spread his divine sense in all directions. He knew that his fight against Sima Xin had not ended. If he had not gone to save Bai Su just now, then Su Ming had an 8/10 of certainty that he would have been able to kill Sima Xin during the continuous cycles of life and death and wind separation. However, the god of Berserker's arts that Sima Xin had inherited from the second generation caught Su Ming's attention. He was certain that Sima Xin had not left and should still be nearby. At that moment, as Su Ming spread his divine sense outwards, a sharp focus appeared in his eyes. He could clearly sense that there was a layer of ice that had not completely melted in the depths of the sea. This ice was different from the world that sealed Great Yu Imperial City. The ice here was shining with a thick layer of blood red. There was a tunnel within the blood red ice, and Su Ming saw Sima Xion's body moving through it with his divine sense, charging straight into the deeper parts of the blood red ice. Wait for me here. Su Ming's determination to kill Sima Xian had never decreased. A glint appeared in his eyes, and he immediately took a step forward and stepped into the seawater, charging towards the depths of the sea. Su Ming was incredibly quick. He even warped and appeared at the bottom of the sea in an instant. Then, he crawled into the tunnel following Sima Xion's tracks and chased after him. This place might be the glaciers on the ground under freezing Sky Clan. However, even though the ice and snow have melted into the sea, it's still here. Looks like Sima Xian obtained his serendipity here. Su Ming charged through the red tunnel. He might have looked relaxed, but in truth, he was incredibly vigilant. He spread his divine sense outwards, and as he moved about, Sima Xion's figure immediately appeared in his divine sense. This was a layer of red ice. The tunnel within the ice was in truth a crack, but for some unknown reason, seawater could not seep through it. The layer of red ice was incredibly thick, causing the crack in the tunnel to be incredibly long. The ground under the ice was crimson red, as if it had been dyed in blood. When Su Ming saw the dazzling crimson with his divine sense, he understood that the seemingly red layer of ice was in truth transparent. It was just a reflection of the bloody world beneath it. In the blood-red world, under the ice, was a gigantic arm that was several hundreds of feet long. It stretched out from the ground towards the sky, and its 5 fingers were in the shape of a claw. It looked as if there was an unyielding spirit buried under the ground that wanted to reach out and crush the sky. That was a left hand. The lines on the palm were clear. The skin might have been rough, but it looked incredibly real. There was also a powerful presence spreading out from that arm that caused Su Ming's divine sense to immediately crumble the moment it touched it. This was the second god of Berserker's left hand. There was a person sitting on that left hand's palm, and that person was Sima Xian. This was the place where Sima Xian obtained his serendipity, and it was also the source of the second god of Berserker's inheritance. If it was not absolutely necessary, he would not have lured Su Ming here. However, the strange battle against Su Ming in the 8th layer of Heaven Gate, the feeling of not being able to control his own actions, the feeling of not being able to control the cycles of time was enough to drive a person mad, and he no longer wanted to experience that sort of pain again. That was why he wanted to fight to the death against Su Ming in this place. As for Su Ming, his divine sense crumbled the moment he saw Sima Xian, causing his footsteps to falter. His face turned slightly pale for a moment before he recovered. With a dark expression on his face, he cast a glance at the crack before him, and after some time, A glint appeared in his eyes before he charged forward. Sima Xin was sitting on the second god of Berserker's left palm at that moment. Killing intent shone in his eyes, and he pressed his hands against the palm by his side. He lifted his head and looked at the layer of ice above him that was illuminated in a crimson shade, and a cold sneer appeared on his lips. After a moment, a freezing glare shone in his eyes. He lifted his hands swiftly and swung them towards the sky. With it, the god of Berserker's left hand started trembling, and an illusory shadow of the left hand manifested within it. As Sima Xin swung his arm, booming sounds reverberated in the air, and the shadow of the second god of Berserker's left hand charged towards the crimson layer of ice above him. With an extreme speed, it charged towards the person charging out of the crimson layer of ice. From afar, this scene was quite astonishing. Impressively, it was as if a huge palm had stretched out from the ground, and with an indescribable speed, it grabbed the figure that was charging through the layer of ice and squeezed it fiercely. A loud rumbling sound shook the heavens and the earth. The layer of ice trembled, and once it shattered, cracks spread out until a large amount of shattered ice appeared. These shattered ice fell on the ground, and for a period of time, the shattered ice filled the air, blocking everyone's vision and reflecting the red light, causing all those who looked at it to feel as if they were unable to see clearly. Sima Xion's pupil shrank. He had been preparing for this attack for a long time, but he did not think that he could kill Su Ming so easily. If Su Ming could be killed so easily, then he would not have been able to survive until now. In Sima Xion's eyes, Su Ming could be said to be his greatest enemy. It did not matter whether it was when he was the prodigy of Freezing Sky Clan in the past, or now that he had obtained the second god of Berserker's inheritance and called himself the fourth god of Berserkers. He had still lost terribly in Su Ming's hands. At that moment, even though Sima Xion's divine ability seemed to have destroyed Su Ming's figure as he stepped through the tunnel, he did not relax in the slightest. His pupils shrank, and he rapidly formed seals with his hands before he swung them swiftly towards the sky. With that one swing, all the shattered ice in the sky exploded and tumbled upwards. Almost at the instant the shattered ice above him tumbled backwards, a powerful sense of danger rose in Sima Xion's heart. At the same time, a figure shot through the sky at an incredible speed, like a shooting star that sliced through the air. It charged towards Sima Xion with loud rumbling sounds. That person was too quick. It was as if he had forced his way into Sima Xion's line of sight, and in the blink of an eye, that person was already less than hundreds of feet away from him. Naturally, that person was Su Ming. Su Ming was incredibly quick. In the blink of an eye, killing intent shone in his eyes, and when he lifted his right hand, he pointed towards Sima Xion. That finger contained Su Ming's will, and it was as if his entire being had fused into that finger. That finger closed in on Sima Xion in an instant with an earth-shattering force. It was a moment of danger. If it was anyone else, perhaps they would not be able to dodge that finger in that extreme speed. However, Sima Xion had been a prodigy in the past, and now that he called himself the fourth god of Berserkers, he had his own pride. Without any hesitation, he opened his mouth wide and did not dodge Su Ming's attack. Instead, he let out a roar that shook the sky and earth. That roar was not a normal roar. It contained the essence of the second god of Berserker's inheritance that Sima Xion had obtained. It was a roar that seemed to come from the ancient past, and with his body as the vessel, it seemed to come from the second god of Berserkers, Qishan Pa. This was the god of Berserker's roar. The instant that roar traveled out, Su Ming's pupils shrank. Booming sounds immediately rang in his ears, and blood flowed out of them. The air around him also started shattering inch by inch, turning into a crumbling, destroyed area. An indescribably powerful force crashed into Su Ming, causing his body, which had been moving forward at an extreme speed, to come to an abrupt halt. His entire body rumbled, and a feeling as if his flesh, blood, and bones were being torn apart spread through his body. Blood trickled out of the corners of Su Ming's mouth, and as he tumbled backwards, he was forced several thousands of feet back by that roar. The might of that roar might be shocking, but it was clear that Sima Xin could not cast it as he pleased. His body started withering away as he roared, as if all his flesh, blood, and essence had been sucked away just to let out that roar. The god of Berserker's left hand shuddered faintly beneath him, and an invisible aura seeped into Sima Xin's body. Once it swam through his body, it started nourishing him. Su Ming, this will be your burial ground. Sima Xin's expression was ferocious as he glared at Su Ming, who was several thousands of feet away in midair. His face was rapidly recovering from its withering state, but as it recovered, he looked incredibly ferocious. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 6:21. Almost at the same time, Su Ming was forced back. A ferocious look appeared on Sima Xin's face. He lifted his hands and swiftly formed a seal, then bit the tip of his tongue and coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. That blood completely fell on the palm beneath him, and as it flowed down the palm lines, it spread out like a trickle, causing the originally dull palm lines to gradually become clearer. As the god of berserkers, I control the fate of the berserkers, the world, and the universe. The lines on my palm lines are like my own pattern, and with them, I can kill. God of berserker's mark. As Sima Xin spoke, he swiftly lifted his hands and pushed upwards. At the instant, Su Ming was continuously forced back by the second god of berserker's roar that had gathered together from the passage of time. Sima Xin's murderous voice reached his ears. Su Ming felt as if his body was being torn apart, but there was not a hint of panic on his face. Instead, a freezing glare shone in his eyes, and even though he was retreating, he lifted his right hand swiftly. The mark of the crimson dragon on his right hand shone with a red light, just like a totem. Intelligence also appeared in the crimson dragon's eyes as it stared at Sima Xin, who was on the second god of berserker's left palm. It was also at this moment that Sima Xin's god of berserker's mark spread out. The entire layer of ice above him darkened at that instant, and red lines appeared out of nowhere around Su Ming. These lines surrounded the entire area, and they might seem chaotic, but if anyone took a closer look, they would be able to see clearly that the lines in the sky were the second god of berserker's left palm lines. A primordial presence spread out in the freezing world. Su Ming's pupils shrank. At the same time the palm lines manifested around him, a dragon's roar came from his right hand. The crimson dragon manifested and surrounded Su Ming. As it lifted its head and roared, the crimson dragon's body immediately swelled up once again. Its body was 10,000 feet long, and it circled around Su Ming. As it roared, the layer of ice above them trembled and fell off. When Sima Xin saw the crimson dragon, his pupils shrank once again. The strength and methods Su Ming displayed had surpassed Sima Xin's expectations time and time again. He did not expect that Su Ming would have a dragon-shaped beast in his possession, and it looked incredibly powerful. Sima Xin's expression was gloomy. At the same time he saw the crimson dragon appear, he formed a seal with his right hand and pointed at the center of his brows. He used the nail of his pinky finger to cut open a long line at the center of his brows, causing blood to flow out. As the blood flowed out, the palm lines above seemed to turn into a huge palm. However, this palm was made of crimson palm lines, and it still looked very real. As booming sounds reverberated in the air, the palm formed by the palm lines clenched into a fist as if it wanted to crush Su Ming in its palm. As he clenched his fist, the air above him trembled. As the huge palm lines condensed and contracted, it seemed to contain some sort of law that existed in the world, causing those who were within it to feel dazed. The instant the palm made of palm lines grabbed Su Ming, the crimson dragon let out a shocking roar. Its body swelled up once again and swept through the area, turning into a gigantic crimson dragon whirlwind. With its body, it fought against the incoming palm lines. Booming sounds surged into the air. As the palm clenched tightly, And as the crimson dragon roared and its murderous aura filled the air, the two powers that Su Ming and Sima Xian executed were evenly matched in the air. All of this happened in the span of a few breaths. As they crashed into each other, a shocking boom shook the area, and, as it trembled, a wave of impact swiftly spread out. Wherever that impact passed, a large part of the ice above would shatter, causing the blood-red color on the ground to turn even more chaotic. The palm lines in the sky shattered inch by inch before exploding with a bang. However, it was, after all, the god of Berserker's divine ability. Sima Xian might not be able to bring out its full power due to his level of cultivation, but even if he could only bring out a small portion of its power, it was still enough to make him feel proud. At the same time the palm shattered, Su Ming's crimson dragon also shuddered and looked as if its body had exploded. Fortunately, it was formed by earthen aura and not real flesh and blood, or else it would have definitely died. Even a body formed by earthen aura also shattered. However, once it did so, the crimson dragon's body manifested once again behind Su Ming. Its face was dispirited and its body was an illusion, as if it could no longer hold on. It turned into a red mark and returned to Su Ming's right arm, falling into deep sleep to recuperate. Your divine ability isn't bad, but you can't kill me with it. Su Ming's face was calm, but killing intent filled his eyes. He lifted his right foot and took a step forward, turning into a long arc that shot through the air and appeared 100-something feet away from Sima Xian. The instant he closed in, Su Ming lifted his right hand, but he did not point forward with a single finger. Instead, he formed his fingers into the shape of a claw and seized the air in Sima Xian's direction. With it, Sima Xian's body shuddered, and he was lifted 3 feet into the air, as if he was bound by the god of Berserker's left hand. This scene made Sima Xian's heart tremble. He was already in shock towards Su Ming. As they continued coming into contact with each other, Su Ming's endless methods had shocked him time and time again. When the Crimson Dragon appeared just now, his shock had reached its peak. He had never expected that Su Ming would become so strong. The hatred and failure in the past had caused Sima Xian to become dispirited. Once he was reborn, he met Su Ming once again as he seized the serendipity from the world, but he failed once again in Heaven Gate. The shadow of death descended on him once again, and it dealt a huge blow to Sima Xian's confidence. The god of Berserker's 7 steps could not do anything to Su Ming. The fan's heaven and earth barrenness was still broken by him. At that moment, the power of the god of Berserker's palm lines was also resisted by Su Ming. This made Sima Xian feel despair for a moment. His eyes were bloodshot. At that moment, he could no longer care about the fact that his inheritance was incomplete and that he needed more time to fuse with the second god of Berserker's left hand. When the day came when he could absorb that arm and turn it into his own left hand, only then would the inheritance be complete. However, he was in danger now, and he could no longer care about forcefully executing an even more powerful divine ability or the backlash his body would suffer. With bloodshot eyes, Sima Xian let out a piercing howl. As he roared, 9 sharp black spikes immediately crawled out of the second god of Berserker's left hand. These spikes exuded a ghastly, freezing air. In fact, there were even black drops of water seeping out of some of the spikes. The freezing air within those water drops spread out, and there was a sinister air about them. God of Berserkers, bone spikes. Sima Xian's face turned pale. As he roared, his body withered once again. This time, his recovery was clearly much slower. As he roared, the black bone spikes separated from the god of Berserker's left hand with a bang, and with a whistling sound as they sliced through the air, they charged towards Su Ming, who was above him, an indescribable speed. Sima Xian's hair danced in the air, and madness appeared in his eyes. Using the chance that the bone spikes were charging towards Su Ming, he pressed his right hand against the god of Berserker's left hand, closed his eyes, and mumbled something, but those words were complicated and no one could hear them clearly. Su Ming's pupils shrank, and a strong sense of danger rose in his heart. There might only be 9 bone spikes coming towards him, but each of them exuded a murderous aura that made Su Ming's skin crawl. The black bone spikes, the black liquid, the chilling feeling, the speed at which they charged towards him, and the air they passed through was dyed black. There was also a seal that filled the air. In fact, Su Ming could even feel that the bone spikes seemed to have locked onto his chi and would chase after him endlessly. He had a strong feeling that if even one of these bone spikes crawled into his body, then the consequences would be incredibly severe. These were not ordinary bone spikes. They were the second god of Berserker's resentment and madness that had been accumulating in his body for countless years, along with the seal that was formed when his body was torn to shreds. And all these other things had fused together to change the bones in his left hand over the course of countless years. And that was how these bone spikes were born. Even a berserker who had attained great completion in the Berserker Soul realm would definitely be shocked if they ran into these spikes. Fortunately, these bone spikes were not endless. There seemed to be only so many in the second god of Berserker's left hand. Yet the moment Su Ming's body froze and he swiftly retreated, Sima Xian lifted his head. At that moment, his entire body looked like a skeleton, and his handsome face looked as if a layer of skin had been ripped off from it as it withered away, revealing a face that was filled with scars and looked terrifying. This was his real face. His skin was brown because Sima Xian's skin and flesh had been frozen in freezing sky cave all those years ago, causing his real face to only have brown flesh. The scars on the flesh would make anyone who saw them feel nauseous at first glance. They were so ugly that they didn't even look like they were human. Sima Xian let out a crazed roar and lifted his right hand, which was pressed against the god of Berserker's palm. When he lifted his right hand, a bone spike in the shape of a long blade was slowly pulled out from the god of Berserker's palm, revealing a section of it. As the bone spike was pulled out, the second god of Berserker's left hand started trembling, and in an instant, Sima Xian lifted his head and roared madly towards the sky, and the bone spike was completely pulled out from his palm. This was a bone spike blade that was about 10 feet long. It was entirely black, and once Sima Xian pulled it out of the god of Berserker's left hand, the freezing air around him instantly became several times stronger, and a murderous aura that surpassed what it had been in the past swept out in all directions. With the bone blade in hand, Sima Xian's face was filled with madness. He glared at Su Ming with hatred, and at that moment, there was only one thought in his head: to kill Su Ming with his own hands and take revenge for what happened in the past. Su Ming. Sima Xian took a step into midair, and for the first time ever, he completely left the god of Berserker's left hand. In midair, he held the gigantic bone blade with both hands, and as the 9 slightly smaller bone spikes charged towards Su Ming, he slashed down. Recommended 2 masterpieces: Immortal Forging Book number 246, 6815, written by a book friend. Deity Throne Book number 247, 0866, Huang Fuqida De. All of you can go and collect it. As for your monthly votes, please give them to Chiomo. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 622. Su Ming's pupils shrank. The 9 black bone spikes charging towards him were not the only things that gave him a sense of danger, but also the gigantic bone blade that was 10 feet long in Sima Xian's hands. The air behind the 9 bone spikes looked as if it had been sliced apart, and everything was corroded black. There was also a chilling, murderous aura crashing into Su Ming's face, as if it contained the second god of Berserker's resentment and madness since ancient times. Sima Xian's appearance changed, and his body withered. All of this fell into Su Ming's eyes, allowing him to tell with just one glance that even Sima Xian would find it difficult to completely control the god of Berserker's treasure made from bone spikes. To him, this might perhaps be a double-edged sword. If that was not the case, then there would have been no need for this battle. This was a treasure born from the second god of Berserker's left hand. This was an item formed from the seal that had gathered together since ancient times. This was definitely not a divine ability that Su Ming could fight against with his current strength. However, Sima Xian's forceful execution of this ability was a chance for Su Ming. At that moment, Su Ming no longer hesitated. Almost at the instant the 9 bone spikes charged towards him, he pushed his left hand against the ground and lifted his right hand swiftly. His palm was facing the sky, and the back of his hand was facing the ground. At the instant the bone spikes closed in, half of his hair turned white, and the other turned purple at a speed visible to the naked eye. His body shrank in the midst of a violent whirlwind that suddenly appeared, and he turned into Destiny. Destiny's appearance caused Su Ming's combat prowess to instantly reach its peak, and he could fight against those who had attained great completion in the Berserker Soul Realm. A grim expression appeared on his face. The instant he turned into Destiny, Su Ming lifted his left hand and swung it towards the incoming bone spikes. With that one swing, it was as if time was flowing backwards before Su Ming, as if time itself was flowing backwards at that moment. As the 9 bone spikes closed in, they crashed into Su Ming's power of reincarnation in the past in an unseen manner. The 9 bone spikes froze for a moment, but it was only for a moment before they closed in once again. However, their speed was much slower this time, as if they were moving through time itself. As for Sima Xian, who was behind the 9 bone spikes and wielding the bone saber, a look of madness appeared on his face. As he slashed down with the bone saber, he paused for a moment. Pain filled his face, but he gritted his teeth and continued onward. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He clenched his right hand into a fist and hurled it forward, turning into a wave of impact that exploded before him. Once it crashed into the incoming 9 bone spikes and Sima Xian, the booming sounds became even stronger, causing the air to collapse in an instant. Su Ming did not stop. When he retreated once again, he swung his left hand a second time before him. This time, not only did he change the speed of the 9 bone spikes and Sima Xian, more importantly, the crumbling area caused by Su Ming's punch immediately recovered and exploded with a bang once again. This process repeated itself, and in the blink of an eye, he had already done it a dozen-something times. Su Ming knew that he could not change too much about the bone spike's impact. It was so strong that it could fight against the power of the past he executed, but it was clear that it had the upper hand. However, what he could change was the punch he had hurled. He could make that punch continuously go through the cycles of life and death, causing its might to reach a terrifying degree. If each punch contained the strongest power equivalent to that of a berserker who had attained great completion in the Berserker Soul Realm, then the fusion of those dozen-something punches might not be able to bring about a qualitative change, but the power gathered together would still surpass that of a normal berserker who had attained great completion. The hint of presence of life cultivation spreading out from Su Ming's body at that moment also caused that punch to reach its peak as he continued going through the cycles of life and death. A loud boom that shook the ground and caused a large part of the ice above to shatter erupted forth at that instant. This was the strongest power Su Ming had gained after going through a dozen-something cycles of life and death, and it was the powerful impact that came from the 9 bone spikes and the incoming Sima Xian. The instant the impact reverberated in the air, due to the fact that the area of the ice above was too large. Shards of ice danced in the air, and cracks spread out to tens of thousands of feet. Eventually, as the ice exploded, seawater tumbled forth with a bang and rushed towards the crumbling ice. The entire world started raining cats and dogs. The rain did not stop, as if it wanted to completely submerge the entire world. As the seawater swiftly spread out and descended, the instant the booming sounds reverberated in the air, Su Ming took a dozen-something steps back. His face was slightly pale, but his eyes remained calm. He took a swift step forward and charged towards Sima Xian. As for Sima Xian, not a single hint of destruction could be seen on the 9 bone spikes before him due to the impact, but their speed had become much slower. The direction they were moving and had also changed slightly due to the impact from Su Ming's punch. However, Sima Xian himself coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. After all, He had yet to obtain the complete inheritance. Forcefully executing the god of Berserker's bone spikes was already his limit. As he coughed up blood, his face turned dull and his body shuddered. He might still be moving forward, but it was clear that the bone blade was driving his body forward. With his extreme speed, Su Ming closed in on the 9 bone spikes in an instant. If it had been the bone spikes from before, then no matter how fast Su Ming was, he would not have been able to avoid them. But it was different now. The speed at which the 9 bone spikes moved made it seem as if there was an invisible barrier between them and Su Ming. Due to the change in their direction, Su Ming looked as if he was rushing towards the bone spikes. But in truth, at the instant he closed in on them, Su Ming's body had already flashed several times. Every single time he moved, he would avoid the bone spikes charging past him from the distance. This scene would give people the impression that they were seeing Su Ming crashing into the 9 bone spikes that had turned into long black arcs, but no booming sounds could be heard. The 9 bone spikes looked as if they had shot through Su Ming's body, and as banging sounds reverberated in the air, they stabbed into the submerged ground. During that instant, the seawater spread past half of the god of Berserker's left hand, and as the bone spikes rushed in, the entire seawater turned black in an instant. Freezing air filled the entire area with whistling sounds. As for Su Ming, once he dodged the 9 bone spikes, he did not let his guard down. He lifted his right hand and hurled a punch towards Sima Xian. He was so quick that before the bone blade in Sima Xian's hand could even swing down, his fist had already landed on his chest. A loud bang reverberated in the air. Sima Xian's eyes went wide, and he coughed out blood once again. His body should have tumbled backwards, but the bone blade in his hand drove his body to cut down on Su Ming. Because of that, the 2 waves of power erupted within Sima Xian's body, causing it to be torn apart with a bang and split into 2 parts. One of them was his right hand and the bone blade, and the other was the rest of his body. As he tumbled backwards, his life force was rapidly fading away. However, while Su Ming's punch might have caused Sima Xian's bone blade to split apart and caused him to be gravely injured once again, the 10-feet-long bone blade still sliced down on Su Ming with a piercing whistle. There was no possibility for Su Ming to dodge it. Even if he used the reincarnation of time to go back to the past, it would not be of much use at that moment. The bone blade was already less than 20 feet away from Su Ming's head, and the chill caused Su Ming's entire body to turn cold. Su Ming lifted his head swiftly, and Han Mountain Bell manifested around him. The 9-headed dragon's shadow also appeared on the bell, and it caused the bell to crash into the bone blade. A shocking boom reverberated in the air, and a shrill roar reverberated in the air. 3 of the 9-headed dragon's heads exploded, and the remaining parts of its body also disappeared in an instant. When it returned to Han Mountain Bell, the bone blade stood on Han Mountain Bell with a monstrous, murderous aura. Bell chimes reverberated in the air, and with a loud crack, a fine crack appeared on the seemingly indestructible Han Mountain Bell, where the bone blade had cut down. The instant the crack appeared, Han Mountain Bell shrank rapidly and returned to Su Ming's body due to the tremors. At that moment, the aura of the bone blade had weakened slightly, but it still charged towards Su Ming with a murderous intent. It was as if it did not kill Su Ming, the blade would not move back even a single inch. In the distance, Sima Xian's life force was no longer disappearing from his broken body. Instead, it was as if a large amount of invisible life force was surging into his body, causing his body to rapidly recover. However, this recovery speed was clearly much slower compared to when Su Ming had met him in Heaven Gate. Su Ming, you will definitely die under my god of Berserker's bone blade. Sima Xian retreated, and as his body recovered, he threw his head back and laughed maniacally. He glared at Su Ming, and his voice fused with his laughter. The layer of ice above them collapsed, and seawater poured down. Most of the sea on the ground had already submerged the god of Berserker's left hand, and his voice echoed in the area. Not necessarily. Su Ming smiled coldly. The instant the bone blade closed in on him, he lifted his right hand and pushed towards it. The instant he did so, a medicinal cauldron immediately appeared on his palm. That medicinal cauldron was what Su Ming used to create medicine. But no matter what, it was still a cauldron, and the barren cauldron within it was the sacred item of the Great Yu dynasty and the entire Berserker tribe. This medicinal cauldron might not be the barren cauldron, but since its shape was that of a cauldron, then it would definitely possess the power it should possess. Another violent rumble spread out. At the instant the medicinal cauldron collided with the bone blade, cracks appeared on the cauldron, but as the cracks appeared, the bone blade clearly slowed down once more. At the same time, Su Ming lifted his left hand and seized the air. Immediately, the spiked club manifested in his hand, and once he grabbed it, he put away the medicinal cauldron and swung it towards the incoming bone blade. The bone blade and spiked club crashed into each other, stirring up the strongest bang in the land, causing the layer of ice above them to spread and shatter once again, causing even more seawater to descend. With a bang, the spiked club shattered. Su Ming had been holding this club up to this point, and when it shattered inch by inch and exploded, the bone blade's speed and power had been reduced time and time again. At that moment, there was less than a third of what had been before. It shot through the spiked club and cut down on Su Ming, but he did not bring out any enchanted treasures. Instead, he lifted his hands, and with a low growl, he slammed his palms together in the direction of the bone blade charging towards his head. A shudder ran through his body, and with his hands 7 inches above his head, he pushed down on the bone blade. Recommend a book for Alliance Master Long Yu, Undying Dust Soul. Everyone, please go and support it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 623. The instant he placed his hands together and blocked the bone blade, a large amount of freezing air immediately spread out from the bone blade and charged into Su Ming's body through his hands, causing his body to feel as if it had been frozen at that moment. However, his eyes were bright, and there was a ferocious look in them. Blood trickled out of the corners of his mouth. This was the first time blood had spilled out of his mouth ever since he turned into Destiny. You think a blade that has followed the wrong master can kill me? Su Ming let out a low growl, and as his body sank downwards, he came to an abrupt halt. He lifted his head and glared at the bone blade. I, Su Ming, am your master. From now on, you will belong to me. The moment Su Ming said those words, the freezing air spread through his hands and turned them black. However, his hair started floating in the air, and his nascent divinity rushed out from his body. Once it turned into a gigantic shadow behind him, it charged towards the bone blade. The instant his nascent divinity touched the bone blade, he felt a strong wave of rejection. However, while that rejection might be strong, the power of the bone blade had been continuously weakened by Su Ming, and at that moment, it had been frozen up. It could not escape, causing Su Ming's nascent divinity to crawl into the bone blade in a frenzy. If it was a normal will controlling the nascent divinity, then perhaps he would not be able to forcefully snatch the blade. But Su Ming's greatest strength was not his cultivation base or his combat abilities, but the will he had formed after going through countless cycles of life and death in the Candle Dragon's undying and imperishable world. The strength of that will far surpassed Su Ming's level of cultivation. Even those who had attained great completion in the Berserker Soul realm could not hope to compare to it. That powerful will might not have much actual combat abilities. It was as if it was empty and rather superficial. But if it fused with his nascent divinity, then the power that would erupt forth from it might not be combat abilities, but it could allow Su Ming to remain unshakable even when he was faced with possession. It could also allow him to possess other people. Unless he ran into someone with a will as strong as his own, then he would have no opponents. There were similarities between possession and forcefully branding an enchanted treasure. That was why Su Ming had first weakened the blade. All of this was for the sake of forcefully taking the bone blade for himself. As Su Ming's nascent divinity charged in, the bone blade initially resisted violently, but in the blink of an eye, a piercing sound came from within the blade. A huge force spread out from the blade, and it looked as if it wanted to break free from Su Ming's hands. "You can't run away from something I've set my eyes on." Su Ming's expression was dark. He pressed his hands against the blade and refused to let go. With an extreme speed, his nascent divinity rushed into the bone blade, and like a hot knife cutting through butter, he suppressed all thoughts of resistance. When Sima Xian saw this in the distance, disbelief and shock appeared on his face. Su Ming's actions shocked him once again. He did not expect that Su Ming would be so determined to snatch the bone blade by force. "You overestimate yourself. This blade was born in the second god of Berserker's left hand, and it has gained sentience since a long time ago. Even if I'm a scion, I can only borrow its power. I can't control it. How dare you be so arrogant as to snatch it?" Sisu Su of his shock and laughed coldly. He, of nascent divinity. Yet even though he did not believe that Su Ming would succeed, Su Ming's entire focus was on snatching the bone blade, which gave him the chance to attack. Without a hint of hesitation, the moment he said those words, Sima Xian, who had mostly recovered, took a step forward and charged towards Su Ming. He closed in on him in an instant, lifted his right hand, and hurled his palm towards Su Ming's forehead. Killing intent shone in his eyes, and that palm strike also contained his irreconcilable hatred towards Su Ming. The instant his palm closed in on him, a glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He let go of the bone blade in his left hand, but his right hand seized the blade. He did not care about the blood flowing out of his hand, causing the bone blade to be unable to break free. Then he swung his left hand down the moment Sima Xian closed in on him. With that one swing, the power of time reversal closed in on him once again. The appearance of that power caused Sima Xian's face to instantly turn pale. He had miscalculated once again. He had originally thought that Su Ming's entire focus was on the bone blade, but he did not expect that Su Ming would still be able to execute this divine ability that terrified him. As he fought against Su Ming, he had made multiple miscalculations and suffered multiple setbacks, which dealt a severe blow to his confidence. In fact, at that moment, he had a feeling that no matter how many serendipities he obtained, he would still be unable to fight against Su Ming's speed. He was bound to lose. That feeling was only a hint in the beginning, but as time passed by and he was once again swept into the cycle of reincarnation by Su Ming, that feeling became his everything. The instant Sima Xian's body was filled with the power of the past, and he fell back instead of getting closer to Su Ming. Su Ming clenched his left hand into a fist and rammed it into Sima Xian's body. When his body collapsed and he coughed up blood, Su Ming swung his left hand once again. The cycle repeated itself. This time, Su Ming's destiny's transformation had clearly lasted for a much longer period of time. This was related to the serendipity he obtained from the blood absconsion tribe and the increase in his level of cultivation. Su Ming might have looked as if he was at a disadvantage during this battle, but in truth, from the moment the two of them truly started fighting, Su Ming could be said to have been in complete control of the situation. He was suppressing Sima Xian with brute force. It was especially so at that moment when Su Ming held the bone blade in his right hand and continued fusing his nascent divinity into it to suppress all resistance from the bone blade so that he could forcefully leave his brand on it. Meanwhile, he was executing the art of the past with his left hand, causing Sima Xian to sink into a state that made him despair. Sima Xian's eyes turned bloodshot. He could not accept this. He absolutely could not accept this. He had obtained the second god of Berserker's inheritance, and this was an incredibly rare serendipity in the entire Berserker tribe. This was a serendipity that countless people would go mad with envy, but he was still being suppressed by Su Ming. In this state of reincarnation, he did not have a single bit of power to fight back, and Su Ming's right hand was still holding onto the bone blade. This made Sima Xian roar in his heart, unwilling to admit defeat. But his roars could not leave his body. As booming sounds reverberated in the air, Sima Xian's body crumbled again and again, and his recovery became slower. If this continued, then before long, he would die safely. But Su Ming sighed in his heart. Sima Xian could be said to be the most difficult person to kill he had ever met after he had perfected his level of cultivation. All of this was because of the great art of heartless berserker seed he practiced. If he did not have this cultivation method, Su Ming would have killed him a long time ago. Even if he had obtained the second god of berserker's inheritance, he was still not Su Ming's opponent. However, Sima Xian's life force was endless, and there was a time limit for Su Ming to transform into destiny. Even though his power had increased by quite a large margin, it was still about to end now. Su Ming's hair was rapidly recovering, and his body was gradually changing. The power of the past he was executing was also becoming much weaker. Sima Xian immediately noticed this. As he slowly recovered from his previous collapse, a fierce glare appeared in his eyes. He finally had the chance to speak. "You can't continue anymore? Su Ming, you can't continue anymore." Sima Xian laughed madly. There was a wound on his chest at that moment, and it was rapidly recovering. When he saw that Su Ming's divine ability was weakening, a ferocious look appeared on Sima Xian's face as he laughed. "Noisy," Su Ming said coldly. The instant his face returned to normal, his hair turned black, and he walked out of destiny. Sima Xian's laughter reverberated in the air, and the power of the reincarnation of the past was no longer binding him, allowing him to swiftly retreat. The bone blade in Su Ming's right hand let out a piercing hum. That hum sounded as if it had submitted, as if it had completely been suppressed, and it let out a final roar filled with unwillingness to admit defeat. As that sound reverberated in the air, Su Ming relaxed his right hand, and the bone blade immediately started spinning, causing the hilt to automatically land on his palm. Once he held it, he circulated all the power of berserker bones in his body. At the instant he did so, a black and murderous aura that surged into the sky erupted from the bone blade. It might not be willing to admit defeat, it might be humiliated, but at that moment, it had no choice but to be controlled by Su Ming. Because under the fusion of his powerful will, Su Ming's nascent divinity forcefully suppressed the bone blade, even if it was born in the second god of berserker's left hand, even if it had existed for countless years. The instant Su Ming held the blade in his hands, he took a step towards the retreating Sima Xian. Sima Xian was originally laughing loudly, but his expression was now swiftly turning into one of shock. Su Ming turned into a long arc, and with the bone blade in hand, he charged forward and slashed down on Sima Xian. Before the blade even reached Sima Xian, a piercing sound slicing through the air rang in the air, as if it had sliced through space itself. The instant an arc of black light flashed, Su Ming's bone blade pierced through Sima Xian's skull and body, cutting him in half as if he had been split into two. Booming sounds shook the sky and earth. Once Sima Xian let out a shrill scream of pain, Su Ming lifted his head. At that moment, he was holding the black bone blade in his hand. His black hair danced in the air, and there was a profound, strange look in his eyes. His expression was aloof, and he was filled with an indescribably enchanting air. As for Sima Xian, the left half of his body turned pitch black when it was separated from his body. In the end, it turned into black liquid that spilled into the sea below. Yet the remaining half of his body fell into the sea in a bloody mess as he fell backwards. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. With the bone blade in hand, he charged towards the sea, but the moment he got close to it, a sense of danger rose within him. Without any hesitation, Su Ming disappeared and reappeared 1,000 feet away. He immediately saw the spot where he had been previously collapsing with a bang and turning into a vortex. The appearance of the vortex caused a vortex to also appear on the surface of the sea. At the center of the vortex was the god of berserker's left hand, which had already been submerged by the sea. Tomorrow, I'll release a new chapter, and I'll use Sima Xian's death to get monthly votes. I also hope that you won't forget about the recommendation tickets. October. My ears are still fine. I'll do my best to update the chapters. No matter what the final result is, please continue fighting with me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 624. Su Ming. If there is no end between us, then I, Sima Xian, will not accept this. With my berserker seed, I will make my blood burn and revert to my ancestors to become the second god of berserkers. Sima Xian's haunting voice came from the whirlpool on the surface of the sea. His voice spread in all directions as the waves roared, causing Su Ming to frown. The difficulty of killing Sima Xian could be said to be something rarely seen in Su Ming's life. Even at this point, he still did not die. This caused Su Ming to gain an incredibly deep understanding towards the great art of heartless berserker seed. He suddenly understood why the second god of berserkers could make the immortals send out so many powerful immortals just to kill him, even though he only had half of the first god of berserkers' power. They had even torn his body apart in the end. All of this must be because the second god of berserkers in the past was much more difficult to deal with compared to the current Sima Xian, and it was even more impossible to kill him. Anyone who had to face this sort of enemy would definitely frown. At that moment, Su Ming had already injured Sima Xian multiple times. If he was calculating based on the number of times he died, then he could be said to have killed him multiple times, but now he was still alive. At this moment, the aura coming from the whirlpool was even stronger than before. As that voice reverberated in the air, the sea roared and rotated. The second god of berserkers' left hand shuddered, and a strong light spread out from the spot where the bone blade had been drawn out of his palm. Within that light, Sima Xian's body appeared. He still looked the same, as if his body had never been torn apart. However, he had become even more withered. He was just skin and bones. His eyes were bloodshot, and his expression was incredibly murderous. He did not stand up. Instead, he pressed his hands against the god of berserkers' palm and lifted his head to stare at Su Ming. His body was indistinct under the strong light, and the instant he looked towards Su Ming, a strange voice tumbled out of his mouth. Soul-breaking art in one incense, blood burn. Sima Xian lifted his head and roared. It was as if his body had been set ablaze, and a wave of heat rose swiftly around him. At the same time, Sima Xian's face changed rapidly. The god of berserkers' arm underneath him started withering rapidly, as if a large amount of its essence had been sucked away by Sima Xian. A crazed roar traveled forth slowly from Adair. That roar did not belong to Sima Xian, neither did it belong to Su Ming. It appeared out of thin air, as if it had always existed in the world. However, only during special times, and only special people could hear that roar. This was the second god of berserkers' unwillingness to accept death, and his roar was filled with resentment towards the immortals. At the instant the roar spread through the area, Sima Xian also lifted his head and let out a low roar. His roar seemed to have fused together with the second god of berserkers' roar to form the same frequency, causing all those who heard it to be unable to differentiate between them. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. When he narrowed them, he took a step forward and appeared beside the god of berserkers' left hand in an instant. With a swing of the bone blade, he drew an arc in the air and charged towards Sima Xian. Almost the instant Su Ming closed in on him, Sima Xian's body swelled up. His hair grew endlessly longer, and his flesh and blood squirmed about. His body became several times stronger, and as his body changed, he became 30 feet tall. At that moment, he no longer looked like Sima Xian, but as if he had turned into another person. A crazed power erupted from his body, and at the same time, Sima Xian stomped on the god of berserkers' left arm with his right foot. He flew up and hurled a punch towards Su Ming's incoming bone blade. Perhaps it could be said that this punch did not belong to Sima Xian, because at that moment his mind was already muddled. This power of burning his blood to forcefully obtain the complete legacy, and then executing it was not something he could control at that moment. If he forced himself to execute it, the damage it would cause him would be great, and only his life could make up for it. This life was his life. He had sacrificed his life, used the life force of all those with the Berserker seed in exchange for it, and all of this was for the sake of killing Su Ming. With that punch, Sima Xian's speed reached its peak. In fact, his afterimage could even be seen on the god of Berserker's palm. His real body had already arrived before Su Ming, and under that punch, Su Ming's pupils shrank. He could sense an indescribable pressure coming swiftly towards him from the front. His robes fluttered backwards, and all the hair on his body stood on end. A strong sense of danger erupted within him, and Su Ming did not have time to think. He lifted the bone blade in his hand and swung it down at the air before him. A shocking boom instantly surged into the air. As it reverberated in the air, the entire area trembled, and Su Ming only felt a great rebound coming from before him. It tumbled backwards from the bone blade and spread through his entire body through his arm. Under that rebound, Su Ming felt as if 100,000 mountains had crashed into his body. He coughed out a huge mouthful of blood and staggered several thousands of feet backwards. With a grave expression on his face, he looked over swiftly. Sima Xian's body manifested in the air. His entire right arm had exploded at that moment. It was a bloody mess, but strangely, it was rapidly recovering. His expression was apathetic and his eyes were lifeless, but there was a powerful presence spreading out from his body. This was the god of Berserker's blood ignition art. It was a strange art that allowed his combat abilities to instantly increase by leaps and bounds. This art was shockingly similar to Su Ming's destiny. When the second god of Berserkers cast this divine ability in the past, he could make the entire Berserker tribe worship him and the immortals tremble because of it. Because of it, the second god of Berserkers still had an unforgettable memory in the immortals' hearts even after the first left. It was also the source of his death. At that moment, Sima Xian's apathetic and lifeless eyes were looking at Su Ming. Not a hint of emotion could be detected on his face. He lifted his right foot and took a step towards Su Ming. The instant his foot landed, the world rumbled, and Su Ming fell back, disappearing in the span of a breath. At the instant he disappeared, the air where he had previously stood immediately shattered, turning into a gigantic black vortex that swept out in all directions. Sima Xian walked out of that vortex and looked towards Su Ming, who had appeared in the distance. Su Ming's expression was incredibly sour. Sima Xian's current transformation had caused his combat abilities to increase exponentially. That punch just now was enough to suppress a Berserker who had attained great completion in the Berserker Soul Realm. If Su Ming could still turn to Destiny, then he could still fight against him, but right then, he had changed back from Destiny and could not fuse with Destiny within a short period of time. Because of that, Sima Xian, whose combat abilities had increased exponentially, was a slight headache to him. When Su Ming saw Sima Xian looking towards him with an expressionless face, as if he had no soul, and lifted his right foot, Su Ming's pupils shrank. Right then, the second god of Berserker's indignant roars could be faintly heard all around him, and the entire area had turned into chaos. The seawater on the ground roared. The ice above them continued collapsing, as if it wanted to completely submerge this place. At that critical moment, a thought appeared in Su Ming's heart. The instant Sima Xian's foot landed and he closed in once again, Su Ming lifted his right hand and patted his storage bag. Immediately, a round medicinal pill appeared on his palm. That medicinal pill was the welcoming of deities. This pill could contain the fragmented souls in the world, and if he swallowed it, he could gather his body together. Its might was unfathomable, and it was largely related to the fragmented souls he could contain. With the welcoming of deities between his fingers, a strange light appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he quickly mumbled under his breath, "Welcoming of deities from all over the world, the remnant thoughts in the universe. If the soul is empty, then everything can be contained." The instant he said those words, a piercing dark light immediately erupted from the welcoming of deities in his hand. That dark light was like a dark sun, causing its light to instantly illuminate the entire area. In an instant, the entire layer of ice above them, the seawater on the ground, and the surging sea were all illuminated by that dark light. As that light surrounded Su Ming, Sima Xian's body swiftly appeared several hundreds of feet away from him. By the looks of it, he had been forced out by that dark light. Almost at the instant his body was revealed, the second god of berserkers' roars in the world of ice in the sea instantly grew louder. Roars reverberated in the air and became clearer with each passing moment. In the span of a breath, it sounded as if he was roaring at the heavens right beside his ears. As his roars echoed in the area, the shadows of black threads appeared out of thin air in all directions. The instant they appeared, they charged towards Su Ming's welcoming of deities. The god of berserkers' left hand, which was standing tall in the whirlpool on the surface of the sea, shuddered. This was the first time someone besides Sima Xian had shaken its body. After all, Sima Xian had only been able to obtain the second god of berserkers' legacy because he was practicing the second god of berserkers' cultivation method. Other people did not have this sort of serendipity. Even if they had found this arm before Sima Xian, it would still have been difficult for them to obtain the legacy. That was why it was impossible for Su Ming to obtain the legacy himself, especially since Sima Xian had already obtained it. This was the same as leaving Sima Xian's brand on the second god of berserkers' left hand. In this sort of situation, even if Su Ming could use the Blackstone fragment to change his presence and deceive the second god of berserkers in an attempt to obtain the legacy, it would still be impossible. However, the appearance of the welcoming of deities completely changed all of this. The welcoming of deities could absorb all the fragmented souls in the world, and among these fragmented souls was the second god of berserkers. If the second god of berserkers' fragmented soul had not always existed, then there would not have been a series of legends that could be sensed by a special person at a special moment, and the place where the second god of berserkers' arm was located was clearly the place with the most fragmented souls. If he activated the welcoming of deities here, then he would definitely be absorbing the second god of berserkers' soul. At that moment, as the god of berserkers' left hand trembled, a large amount of black mist immediately erupted from within and turned into an illusory layer of fog in midair that charged towards the welcoming of deities. In an instant, it fused into the welcoming of deities, causing the pill to tremble viciously. Its color changed abruptly, and a primordial presence spread out from within. It was as if it had turned into a gigantic vortex that was continuously absorbing all the fragmented souls in the place. Exploded? Exploded. Brothers, grab your weapons and charge. Increase your monthly votes. First. We only need to be first. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 625. All of this might have seemed to have happened over a long period of time, but in truth, only the span of a few breaths had passed since Su Ming brought out the welcoming of deities and absorbed the fragmented souls from all directions. Fog surrounded the welcoming of deities, and a large amount of it spread out, enveloping Su Ming's right hand. The second god of berserkers' roars did not seem to be coming from around him, but from the welcoming of deities in Su Ming's hand. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and without any hesitation, he swallowed the welcoming of deities. The instant he did so, Sima Xian, who had been forced out, closed in once again and appeared right before Su Ming. His face was apathetic, and without a hint of emotion, he hurled his fist forward. Booming sounds reverberated in the air. Su Ming took 7 steps backwards, and as he did so, Sima Xian moved with him. He clenched his fist and was about to hurl it forward once again. Su Ming took his first step back, and a dark light shone in his left eye. When he took his second step back, his expression calmed down, and his hair grew longer in a strange manner. When he took his third step back, the same dark light that shone in his left eye appeared in his right eye. That dark light flashed and it looked incredibly bizarre. When he took his fourth, fifth, and sixth steps back, Su Ming's body became thinner, and the dark light in his eyes became stronger. His hair spread to his feet, and the instant he took his seventh step, a power that did not belong to him erupted forth from within him. The instant that power erupted, Sima Xin closed in on him. Right when he saw that his fist was about to hurl itself towards Su Ming's head, a dark light shone in Su Ming's eyes. He opened his mouth and let out a roar that shook the sky and earth. The moment he roared, Sima Xin's incoming punch came to an abrupt halt. His flesh and blood immediately crumbled under Su Ming's roar, and even his body started shattering inch by inch as if a violent gust of wind had swept through it. At the same time, Sima Xin swiftly retreated. The instant he did so, the apathetic expression on Sima Xin's face changed for a moment. He widened his eyes, and disbelief appeared on his face once again. His breathing quickened, and his body trembled. His disbelief caused an indescribable shock to rise within him towards Su Ming. The god of berserkers roar. This is the god of berserkers roar. This is impossible. This is absolutely impossible. Sima Xin's voice was filled with shock. This was indeed the god of berserkers roar. Su Ming stood in midair and looked at Sima Xin. A dark light shone in his eyes. At that moment, his mind was clear, but his control over his body was a little shaky. It was as if there was another force outside his body that was controlling it and making it fight according to his will. This power came from the welcoming of Spirit's powder, and it came from the remnant souls of heaven and earth that the powder absorbed. In fact, Su Ming had an even stronger feeling in his heart at that moment, and that feeling came from the god of berserkers' left hand in the sea. It was a feeling as if blood was thicker than water, as if that left hand belonged to him. He could even vaguely sense a connection and call from the god of berserkers' left hand. However, Su Ming knew that this feeling was not caused by him. Instead, it came from the soul fragments in the welcoming of deities from the second god of berserkers' soul in the world he had absorbed. Su Ming, Sima Xin. During their first battle in Freezing Sky Clan, all the people who were watching had a misconception that the two people's divine abilities were incredibly similar. Their temperaments were also the same, and this misconception was remembered by many people. At that moment, even though there were no spectators in the final battle between the two of them, Su Ming and Sima Xin were showing a scene that was incredibly similar to the one they were fighting against. If Sima Xin had obtained the second god of berserkers' inheritance at that moment and used the power of the god of berserkers' arm to push his combat abilities to their limits, which was why he had become like this, then Su Ming could be said to have also obtained the second god of berserkers' inheritance. However, his method was different from Sima Xin's. He had absorbed the second god of berserkers' soul, and with his soul, he would enter his spirit, and with his spirit, he would be able to contain his body. Sima Xin had inherited the god of berserkers' power, and with his power, he would use his body to scatter his spirit. Different inheritances, different manifestations, different methods. But what was the same was the second god of berserkers. Su Ming closed his eyes and spread out his will to fuse with the power of the welcoming of deities in his body. When he opened his eyes, he lifted his right foot and took a step forward. The instant he did so, an illusion immediately appeared under the layer of ice above him, and within that illusion was a gigantic footprint that appeared with a loud bang. This was the god of berserkers' 7 steps Sima Xin had cast just now. At that moment, when Su Ming executed it, Sima Xin's body tumbled backwards, and he lifted his right hand to hurl a punch toward the gigantic footprint coming towards him from the sky. With a loud bang, the footprint crumbled and disappeared, and Sima Xin was forced back several hundreds of feet once again. When he lifted his head, madness appeared in his eyes. This is impossible. I'm a second god of berserkers' scion. I am. In his madness, Sima Xin swiftly lifted his hands and brought them together above his head. With his index finger and thumb, he formed a circular mark. At the same time that mark appeared, A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He also lifted his hands and touched his 4 fingers above his head, forming the same mark as Sima Xian's. I know all of the inherited divine abilities you obtained, Su Ming said languidly, and a dark light shone in his eyes. At that moment, he had completely let go of his control over his body, allowing himself to fight based on the power of the welcoming of deities. God of Berserker's transformation of the stars, sun, and moon. First transformation. Stars disaster. Sima Xian let out a low growl and spread his arms apart above his head before swinging them toward the sky. With that one swing, the layer of ice above him immediately crumbled. As a large portion of it disappeared, an illusion appeared. That illusion was a galaxy. Starlight shone in that galaxy, and there were countless stars within it. At that moment, those stars were moving, and as they shone, they turned into a gigantic arm that looked as if it had stretched out of the galaxy and was charging towards Su Ming. Su Ming was also mumbling the same words under his breath. With one swing, another galaxy appeared in the screen of stars above him. However, this galaxy was completely different from the one Sima Xian had swung out. This was a galaxy that was unfamiliar to the people of South Morning. This was the night in Dark Mountain that belonged to Su Ming's memories. As the starlight shone in that galaxy, it also turned into an arm. Once the 2 arms of stars appeared, they crashed into each other with a bang, and a force that could shatter the sky and earth erupted forth at that instant. The galaxy was torn apart, and the layer of ice above completely collapsed. A large amount of seawater surged in madly, causing the layer of ice to be instantly covered by the seawater. By the looks of it, before long, this place would truly turn into the bottom of the sea. Sima Xian coughed out blood and took a few steps backwards. Just as he was about to absorb the power from the god of Berserker's left hand to restore his life force, he discovered to his shock that he could not absorb the power from the god of Berserker's left hand. It was as if there was a will in the god of Berserker's left hand that was preventing him from absorbing the legacy. Sima Xian, now it's my turn to attack, Su Ming said calmly. As he lifted his right hand in midair, his entire body bent slightly, and he looked as if he had turned into a crescent moon. The instant the crescent moon appeared, the words that made Sima Xian despair tumbled out of Su Ming's mouth. God of Berserker's transformation of the star, sun, and moon. Second transformation, movement of the moon. The moment he said those words, a powerful dark light shone from Su Ming's body. As that dark light shone, Su Ming turned into a crescent moon. Moonlight shone on the area, and wherever it went, a desolate, killing intent would follow. Almost at the same time he executed that divine ability, the shadow of a moon immediately appeared around Sima Xian's body. That shadow enveloped his entire body, and a true sense of life-threatening danger rose in Sima Xian's heart. With Sima Xian's legacy and his level of cultivation, he could only execute the transformation of the star, sun, and moon. As for the other 2 styles, he could not execute them. At that moment, when he saw the even stronger movement of the moon being executed by Su Ming, he lifted his right hand in despair and struck his chest. With that one strike, he coughed out a mouthful of blood. His berserker bones shattered, his foundation in the awakening realm crumbled, his will in the berserker soul shattered, and all the power in his body fell into chaos. Without any life force to nourish him, he would definitely die from this chaos. Yet at that moment, Sima Xian knew that if he did not do this, he would also die. That was why he might as well give it his all. Before he died, he would make Su Ming die with him. Let us die together. Blood trickled down the corners of Sima Xian's mouth. With a ferocious look on his face, he lifted his right hand and did the exact same action as Su Ming. God of Berserker's star, sun, and moon. Second transformation, movement of the moon. As Sima Xian roared, his body turned into a crescent moon in the world at the bottom of the sea, just like Su Ming. If the power in his body did not fall into chaos, and he did not shatter it before erupting, then he would not be able to execute the second transformation of star, sun, and moon. At that moment, he cast this art without regard for anything else, and with his death as the price. The shadow of a crescent moon immediately appeared around Su Ming. Moon slaughter. Moon slaughter. Two voices that were exactly the same erupted swiftly in the world at the bottom of the sea. At the instant they did so, the shadow of the crescent moon around Su Ming and Sima Exine shattered. Even their bodies seemed to have fused together with the shadow, and as it shattered, booming sounds rang in the air. In the midst of those booming sounds, Su Ming coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. His body tumbled backwards, and he was forced back 1,000 feet. When he coughed up blood once again, he lifted his head swiftly. Sima Xian's right arm exploded, and his right leg shattered. His body was flung into the air, and his blood filled the air. The right arm and right leg he lost did not recover like before. Instead, they would remain there forever. I can't accept this. I can't accept this. Sima Xian screamed shrilly. He could feel his life force disappearing from his body. At that moment, he was about to die, but he could not accept this. This is not my fate. This is definitely not it. Urgent request for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 6:26. Sima Xian's shrill howl echoed in the air. His body stopped thousands of feet away, and his left hand began to rot. His left leg trembled and withered rapidly. His body was already showing signs of decay. His hair fell off, and a large amount of black spots appeared on his face. Those black spots rotted away and let out a foul stench. This was not caused by the power of the moon slaughter, but by the power of the curse Su Ming had gathered together when he executed the movement of the moon. You know all of my divine abilities, but this is the last divine ability and magical technique I'll ever use in my life. You definitely won't know it. Sima Xian's eyes were dull. When he lifted his head to look at Su Ming, a crazed smile appeared at the corners of his lips. It was a smile formed due to resentment, unwillingness, and all sorts of other things before a person died. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it was not a smile, but an expression that was neither crying nor smiling, and its name was unknown. The god of Berserker's life will be punished by being torn apart. Their bodies will be torn to shreds so that they can seal the land of Berserkers for generations to come. This is the will of true Morning Tao. Sima Xian mumbled. These words had appeared in his head the instant he touched the second god of Berserker's left hand in the past. This was the power that sealed the second god of Berserkers. That power did not belong to Sima Xian, but to the underwater world where he and Su Ming were at that moment, because this was the place where the second's left hand was sealed, because the sealing power had always existed in this place. What Sima Xian was doing was just activating the seal so that it would be activated at that moment to seal all those who were related to the second god of Berserkers. Almost at the instant he said those words, the seawater stopped moving. The sea that surged towards him from above also stopped moving, as if it had stopped moving. The god of Berserker's left hand trembled in the sea, and waves of yellow light shot out of it. The 5 worlds will suppress Berserker arm. When the 5 worlds move, the universe will close its eyes, and e'en death will open. Sima Xian laughed loudly. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. Just as he was about to close in, Sima Xian closed his eyes as he laughed. I lost, but I didn't lose to you, Su Ming. I lost to fate. Heavens, if I, Sima Xian, already exist in this world, then why did Su Ming also appear? Could it be that this is my destiny? That I, Sima Xian, am destined to fight against Su Ming, and only the one who survives can be considered prodigy? Sima Xian laughed madly, and as he laughed, tears streamed down his face. As he laughed, his left arm suddenly exploded, and his left leg rotted into liquid. From a moment Sima Xian obtained the second god of Berserker's inheritance up until this moment, from his initial joy to his current despair, he had gone through far too much. At that moment, as he looked at Su Ming, the hatred within him could not be described with words. Even if he died, he would drag Su Ming down with him. If this is my destiny, then I will fight back. Between the two of us, there will be no survivors. I want him to die with me. I want this destiny to not affect me. As soon as Sima Xin said those words, his body exploded with a bang, transforming into a large amount of black chunks of flesh that fell onto the surface of the sea. Sima Xin, the prodigy of Freezing Sky Clan, the one who had obtained the second god of Berserker's inheritance, the one who called himself the fourth, ended his life right before Su Ming in the place where he obtained his inheritance, the place where he became so powerful as his body shattered. No more life came to him. Perhaps his life had already been decided the moment he met Su Ming in Han Mountain City. If he did not die, then Su Ming would die. At the moment of his death, a ray of red light flew out from Sima Xion's mangled body. That red light was a red puppet. That puppet had the appearance of Sima Xion, but there was a drop of dried blood at the center of his brows, and under that drop of blood was a lock of white hair. That hair was very short and very soft. It did not look like an adult's hair, but more like a baby's hair, but it was white. There was no life within it. There was only a thick aura of death that Su Ming was familiar with. That aura of death was something Su Ming was familiar with. What made him even more familiar was that strand of hair and that drop of dry blood. He might have never seen that strand of hair and blood before, but that familiar feeling made him feel as if that strand of hair and blood belonged to him. At that moment, cracks appeared on the puppet's body, and with a bang, it shattered into pieces. The instant it shattered, the white strand of hair that was dyed in blood floated in the air. No one knew whether it was a coincidence, but it floated to Su Ming's side and landed in his hand. The instant the strand of hair touched Su Ming's palm, his entire body shuddered. Wind and clouds stirred up in his eyes, and as they tumbled about, his mind felt as if it was being pulled by that strand of hair, and he entered a strange world. Su Ming only felt booming sounds reverberating in his head. He saw himself rushing out of the depths of the sea, and once he rushed out of the surface of the sea, he charged towards the sky. Clouds tumbled about, and he rushed out of the protective screen of light that enveloped this place, charging towards the endless sky at an extreme speed. When he reached the end of the sky, shot through the dark clouds that covered the sun, and appeared in the clear sky, he did not stop. As if there was a string tied to his body, as if it was guiding him, he continued rising into the sky. He did not know how much time had passed, but the clear sky was no longer there, and a layer of black fog appeared around him. He was familiar with that fog. It was the fog from Death region. It was the fog that had surrounded the ancient bronze sword in the past and prevented it from getting out. Su Ming continued rising in that fog in a daze until he heard roars. A beast with the head of a crocodile, but the body of a dragon that was of an unknown length peeked its head out of the fog before him, as if it was hesitating about something as it looked around itself. A powerful feeling that almost made Su Ming's mind crumble spread out from the beast's body, but it clearly did not see him. Su Ming could feel himself moving through the black fog as he continued charging upwards. On the way, he saw more than dozens of powerful, strange, ferocious beasts. In fact, the ones he saw at the very end gave him a feeling that they were even stronger than Tion's clone. Eventually, the mist above him began to thin out. Roaring sounds could be heard as he burst out of the black mist. He could see the starry sky, the heavenly bodies, and everything he had seen on the ancient bronze sword all those years ago. Su Ming also saw the vortex formed by the black fog beneath him clearly. It was a gigantic vortex that covered an incredibly large area in the endless galaxy. That vortex rotated with loud, rumbling sounds, and as the fog surrounded it, the aura of death filled the entire area. Su Ming looked at the galaxy and the stars. His body was still floating, but he could not control it. He arrived at a land floating in a galaxy that was located at an unknown distance away from him. This was a desolate land. There were no living creatures in it, only a towering altar. There was a person lying on it, and he was lying there calmly. His limbs were nailed to the ground, and his blood had dried up and filled the area. There was a drop of blood at the center of this person's brows, and there was a strand of white hair on that drop of blood. This person looked like a young man, but at the instant Su Ming saw his face, a bang went off in his head. This was Sima Xian. In the midst of his shock, Su Ming whipped his head around and saw altars similar to this one suddenly appearing on the originally desolate land. There were so many of them that they covered the entire area, and by the looks of it, there were hundreds of them. These altars were not of the same size either. 5 of them were incredibly tall, and they far surpassed the others. As Su Ming looked at them, he suddenly had an urge to see whether there were corpses like this on the other altars. Yet right at the instant he was about to look over, a great suction force appeared on his body and dragged him backwards. With an extreme speed, he instantly retreated and charged towards the vortex in Death region. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He was just about to activate his cultivation base to force himself to stay in this place and take a look when he realized that he did not have a body. He was just a wisp of his will. In anguish, Su Ming's body was swept backwards, but within his eyes was a madness that silently remembered everything. As he retreated, he saw an endless amount of continents floating in the galaxy. There were altars like this on each of the continents, as if they had formed a gigantic rune. At the center of that rune was a continent, and on that continent, Su Ming could vaguely see a gigantic altar. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the continent at the center was itself an altar. Su Ming might have only cast a glance at it, but he could sense a call coming from his soul. This was the last time he saw it. When Su Ming's world became clear once again, he was standing at the bottom of the sea, and that strand of white hair floated in his hand. That strand of hair gradually shattered and eventually disappeared without a trace. Su Ming stood there quietly and closed his eyes. At that moment, the god of Berserker's left arm, which was shining with yellow light, let out a loud bang and shone brightly, illuminating the entire bottom of the sea. A gigantic 5-direction seal manifested on the second god of Berserker's left arm. That seal enveloped the god of Berserker's left arm like a seal, and no one knew how long it had been there. That seal was naturally the 5-direction seal that was suppressing the second god of Berserker's left arm. It was also the treasure that Sima Xian was confident could make Su Ming die with him. There was only one use for that treasure, and that was to suppress and seal all those who were related to the second god of Berserkers. It would seal away all of the second god of Berserker's power. However, due to the passage of time, its power had been greatly reduced, and due to the second god of Berserker's strength, the 5-direction seal had fused with the left arm. Once they became one, the seal's suppressive power weakened once again, which was why Sima Xian had been able to obtain its legacy. Yet now, due to Sima Xian's madness, the seal was awakened, the water at the bottom of the sea became still. The waves at the bottom of the sea did not move. Everything at the bottom of the sea had become motionless. Besides Sima Xian's body crumbling, the floating strand of white hair, and Su Ming's body, everything else had been frozen. Su Ming opened his eyes. Monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 627. At the instant he opened his eyes, the 5-direction seal on the god of Berserker's left hand shone with a gentle yellow light in this relatively still world. That light was like gold, causing the depths of the still sea to be illuminated in a golden light. Su Ming's body was also illuminated by that golden light. His face was already indistinct, but he was shining with a gentle golden light. There was no sign of danger to him, but in this still world, that golden light was a little strange, because everything within the area enveloped by that light disappeared without a single sound, be it the seawater or the layer of ice. It was as if that golden light could devour everything. As the area around it disappeared, It looked as if the golden light was slowly shrinking once it scattered. As it shrank and the light returned, its edge and the bottom of the sea seemed to have been separated into two different dimensions. A sealing power surrounded the golden light. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and with a swift move, he disappeared from the spot. Yet almost the moment he disappeared, Su Ming reappeared on the spot with a dark expression on his face and a frown on his face. He had warped just now, but he had been forced out of the space around him. The sealing power in this place had isolated everything from the world. As Su Ming watched the golden light around him continue shrinking until its edge turned black, he took a step forward and turned into a long arc. He lifted his right hand and seized the air. Immediately, the bone blade appeared in his hand and turned into the tip of the long arc that charged towards the shrinking golden light barrier. A loud bang reverberated in the air, and Su Ming tumbled backwards. Once he took 7 to 8 steps back, his expression turned even darker. He could not pierce through the sealing power contained within the golden light barrier. As the golden light continued shrinking, Su Ming lifted his head and looked upwards with a grave expression on his face. He saw another faint layer of gold beyond the golden light above him, and it was not just one layer either. There were 5 of them. The 5 layers of light were all golden, from the deepest to the faintest. This was the 5-direction seal. Each layer of gold represented the sealing power of one area. As of then, all 5 had appeared at the same time, causing the sealing power to be extraordinary. The golden light around them continued shrinking with the god of Berserker's left hand as the center, causing Su Ming to have to take a few steps forward. He could not stand at the edge, as if he was in a cage that was continuously shrinking. He could only move forward as the cage shrank. Su Ming frowned. Sima Xian might have died, but the power of the seal he had cast before he died was incredibly strange, causing Su Ming to be unable to leave no matter how many times he tried. Besides, judging by the area covered by the golden light, even if he had immediately left, he would still have been enveloped by it and eventually sealed in this place. Judging by Sima Xian's madness just now, this seal must be the seal that sealed the second god of Berserker's left hand. Now that I've used the welcoming of deities to absorb the second god of Berserker's soul fragments, it can be said that I've obtained a part of his legacy. Because of that, the seal believes that I've fulfilled the requirements to be sealed. Su Ming's eyes sparkled. At that moment, the second god of Berserker's left hand that had stood erect in this place for countless years was several dozens of feet away from him. The slowly shrinking golden light was 100 feet away from him. As for the area beyond the light and beyond the 5th layer, it was a dark void that looked like a ravine that was clearly separated from the seawater around it. Sima Xian thinks that I've obtained the same legacy as him. But in truth, I've used the welcoming of deities to absorb soul fragments. It's easy for me to leave this place. As long as the seal thinks that I don't have the second god of Berserker's presence on me, I can leave. A pensive look appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He looked at the golden light, and as his eyes sparkled, he opened his mouth abruptly. Immediately, a dark ray of light appeared and turned into the welcoming of deities before him. The instant the welcoming of deities left Su Ming's body, his presence became much weaker. All the divine abilities and arts related to the second god of Berserkers also faded away. His control over his body also reached its peak, and he was no longer as rusty as before. More importantly, the moment the welcoming of deities left his body, he no longer felt the power of the seal within the shrinking golden light around him. I knew it. Su Ming's brows did not relax. He was still frowning, and a hint of hesitation appeared on his face. He looked at the second god of Berserker's left hand by his side, then at the 5-direction seal's golden light, and he became uncertain. If I leave now, there shouldn't be too much danger. I can return to the surface of the sea and return to the 9th summit, but the second god of Berserker's left hand will be sealed once again. If I come back to search for it, I might not be able to find it. Su Ming's gaze fell on the dark ravine that separated the screen of light from the seawater. Clearly, This place had been split into two regions. It would be much easier to leave this place compared to entering from the outside world. But it'll be a pity if I leave. Su Ming frowned. He was not too interested in the second god of Berserker's legacy, but he was rather sentimental towards Sima Xian's great art of heartless Berserker seed. More importantly, Su Ming had seen the second god of Berserker's divine abilities and arts on Sima Xian's body, and he had also sensed them just now. These divine abilities were exactly what he lacked at the moment. Besides, the second god of Berserker's left hand can allow Sima Xian to continuously recover from his injuries, so there must be a large amount of life force contained within it. If I can absorb the second's left hand, then I might be able to reach a breakthrough once again with 8/10 of my Berserker bones. When Su Ming thought of this, his heart raced against his chest. On one hand, he could leave safely, but there would not be a lot of serendipity. On the other hand, he could stay and attempt to absorb the god of Berserker's left hand, but no matter whether he succeeded or failed, he would have to risk being sealed in this place forever. How should he choose? There was only a short amount of time before him, and he did not have much time to think about it. His eyes sparkled, and he gritted his teeth. Riches come from danger. There's no serendipity in this world that comes without a reason. I have to fight for everything myself in exchange for it. I might have obtained a serendipity in the Candle Dragon's undying and imperishable world and his blessings, but the prerequisite for all of this was that I had to take a huge risk to obtain it. Su Ming looked at the golden light around him closing in on the god of Berserker's left hand. The screen of light above him was also sinking, causing the space between Su Ming and the god of Berserker's left hand to become smaller. The light shining from the five-direction seal was no longer gentle. Instead, there was a fierce, awe-inspiring pressure within it, as if it wanted to suppress all things related to the second god of Berserkers and complete the mission given to it in the past. I'll take the risk. A resolute look appeared on Su Ming's face. If he left just like this, he would definitely not be satisfied. He might as well take the risk. The instant he made his decision, Su Ming lifted his right hand and grabbed the welcoming of deities. Once he swallowed it once again, his presence instantly changed. His pupils turned even darker, and an indistinct shadow seemed to have appeared within them. With one move, he took a step forward and stepped on the second god of Berserker's left hand. This was the first time Su Ming stepped on the second god of Berserker's left hand. Just like Sima Xian, the instant Su Ming stepped on the palm, he sat down cross-legged. It's very warm. This was the first thing Su Ming felt when he touched the god of Berserker's left hand. It was an indescribable warmth, as if he had seen it before. The instant he sat down on the second god of Berserker's left hand, the light from the five-direction seal above him increased exponentially. The gentle light turned into a piercing light, and the awe-inspiring pressure contained within it also increased endlessly at that moment. I don't want your inheritance. I only want your life force and the divine abilities that belong to the god of Berserkers, Su Ming said languidly. At the same time he closed his eyes, he lifted his hands and pressed them against his sides, pressing them against the god of Berserker's left palm. The instant his hands touched the second god of Berserker's left palm, Su Ming sucked in a sharp breath, and a vast wave of life force surged into his body through his hands with loud booming sounds. This was the power contained within the second god of Berserker's left hand. That power was the reason why his hand could not be destroyed, and besides Sima Xian, no one else could absorb this power. Due to his level of cultivation, Sima Xian could not absorb too much of that power. He had originally intended to absorb this power every single time his level of cultivation increased, and when his level of cultivation reached perfection, he would absorb all the power within the god of Berserker's left hand. Once it became his own, he would be able to obtain a portion of the second god of Berserker's power. Yet now, with Sima Xian's death, no one could absorb the power within the god of Berserker's left hand. However, due to the welcoming of deities, Su Ming had indirectly obtained the second god of Berserker's inheritance. causing him to become a person who could absorb that power. Besides, the amount of life force required by all the berserker bones in Su Ming's body was simply too great, and it was not something Sima Xin could compare to. That was why Su Ming's absorption this time was as if he had turned into a bottomless pit. As he closed his eyes and the life force surged into his body, the second god of berserkers' left hand shuddered, and his fingers, which had not moved since ancient times, started moving slowly. Eventually, those 5 fingers slowly closed up and turned into a shield that protected Su Ming's body within his palm. This sort of protection was a form of feigned acknowledgement. This was originally a serendipity that belonged to Sima Xin, but now it had become Su Ming's. If Sima Xin had not died and saw this, he would definitely have coughed up blood because all of this belonged to him. Su Ming lifted his head. His long hair danced in the air as he looked at the golden light closing in on him. It continued until the light completely covered the god of berserker's left hand, and the 5-direction seal floated above his head, causing the area around him to be completely sealed within. The area was filled with dead silence. Only Su Ming could be seen sitting cross-legged and unmoving through the crack that was revealed when the second god of berserker's left hand was closed up slightly. Time trickled by. There were many people gathered on the 9th summit on the surface of the sea beyond the sealed region. These people were all survivors from Heaven Gate, and at that moment, all of them had complicated expressions on their faces as they occasionally looked towards the sea. Vaisu was also looking at the sea quietly from a corner. There was a slightly anxious look on her face. The bald crane was standing on Hu Zi's back in the cave abode where he was snoring loudly. Its sharp beak would occasionally peck at Hu Zi's back, and a thin line would be drawn out by its teeth. It would chomp down on Hu Zi and swallow it with a look of great satisfaction on its face. Weren't you playing hide-and-seek with your Grandpa Crane just now? Hurry up and hide. If you hide properly, I'll find you and eat you. I've sent the 4th chapter. Do you still have any monthly votes? To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 628. Sima Xin was dead. Su Ming's serendipity was about to rise. The answer was about to be revealed. 12,000 updates. Please get 1 vote per person. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 629. In the depths of the sea, the layer of ice had already disappeared as it shattered. The entire seabed was dark and filled with dead silence. If anyone looked over, they would not find a single ray of light besides darkness. There was no gold here, and neither could they find the spot where the second god of berserker's left hand had been. Even if they could accurately know the spot where the god of berserker's left hand had been, they would still only see emptiness when they looked over. It was as if nothing existed, and not a single trace of it could be seen. However, in this region that could not be seen with the naked eye and could not be detected by divine sense was a dimension that was separated from the sea. There was golden light surrounding that dimension, and as that light spread out, it turned into golden runic symbols that circled in the air, causing the small dimension to be filled with an innumerable amount of runic symbols. The light could not be seen from the outside. At the center of the dimension, filled with golden runic symbols, were 5 layers of golden screens. They looked oval, and the golden screens fluctuated as if they were breathing. It was a strange dimension and a strange 5-layered screen of light. At the deepest part of the screen of light was a gigantic arm. That arm was incredibly crude, and it stood tall with its palm clenched slightly. Sitting on that palm was a young man with his eyes closed. The young man had long black hair that spilled over his shoulders. He was handsome, and his face was slightly flushed. He would only breathe after a long while. His hands were pressed against the center of the palm, and anyone could clearly see that the palm had fused with him. Waves of aura spread out and seeped into the person's entire body, seeping into his eyes, nose, mouth, and mouth. Su Ming looked as if he was meditating quietly, but there was a storm raging in his body. At that moment, he was going through a tremendous change. An endless amount of life force was continuously fusing into his body, and as it swam through his body, it was rapidly devoured and absorbed by his berserker bones. Su Ming's level of cultivation was unique. Other people might only have 20-something berserker bones, but for Su Ming, every single bone in his body had the possibility of turning into a berserker bone. In fact, his flesh, blood, and everything else in his body was the same. As he rapidly absorbed the life force, and after an unknown amount of time had passed, Su Ming obtained his own serendipity. Nearly 9/10 of all his berserker bones had turned into true berserker bones. Once he completed all of it, then Su Ming's level of cultivation would immediately reach a new height, and what awaited him would be a true berserker soul realm that no one before him, and perhaps no one in the future, would be able to do so. If he succeeded, then Su Ming's level of cultivation would reach a new peak. Even if he did not turn into destiny, he would still be able to fight against those who had attained great completion in the berserker soul realm and not be at a disadvantage. Unless they ran into those old monsters who had been lying dormant for an endless amount of years in the berserker soul realm and had already discovered a hint of the presence of life cultivation with their great power. But even so, the outcome of the battle was still unknown. However, the prerequisite for all of this was for Su Ming to possess all of his berserker bones and step into the berserker soul realm. As Su Ming absorbed it, a gigantic figure appeared in his mind. That figure's face could not be seen clearly, but it was executing divine abilities and arts in Su Ming's mind. These arts were varied. Su Ming could see some of them clearly, but some of them only appeared in a flash. When Su Ming took a closer look, he found it difficult to find too many clues. Besides these divine abilities, there were also some pictures. These pictures were rather chaotic, and they would usually disappear after appearing on one side. They could not be connected to each other. There were only a few pictures that could be connected to each other. One of them was the gigantic figure floating into the air without moving his feet. When he flew into the distance, he was in a dazzling galaxy. Before him was a gigantic sphere, and within it was a sea and land. It was like a complete world. At the instant the figure closed in on the world, an endless amount of long arcs flew up. As whistling sounds reverberated in the air, Su Ming saw the figure in the picture lifting his foot and taking 7 steps forward. When he took those 7 steps, the entire galaxy trembled. When his first step landed, the impact stirred up caused most of the long arcs to tumble backwards. When he took his second step, there were no longer any long arcs blocking his path. When he took his third step, he stepped into the world, causing the entire sphere to tremble with a bang. When he took his fourth step, seawater tumbled about and drowned everything. When he took his fifth, sixth, and 7th step, the sphere looked as if it had gone through a disaster. It shattered with a bang, and the figure threw his head back and let out a low roar. With it, the shattered world crumbled swiftly. Once it shattered, a ray of crystalline light flew out and was seized by the figure. It was a crystal shining with flowing streams of light, and within it was the power of an entire world. It was the power of an entire world. With the crystal in hand, the figure leapt into the distance. God of Berserker's 7 steps, God of Berserker's roar. Su Ming mumbled. The picture flashed, and the same figure appeared in Su Ming's mind again. However, this time his face was not too indistinct. Su Ming could see that he had a very normal face, and there was even a simple and honest air about him. There was not a hint of awe-inspiring might about him. It was especially so when he smiled. He gave off a much more cordial feeling. As Su Ming looked at this person's face, he gradually found a hint of familiarity on his face. That familiarity came from when he had used the power of possession to search through his memories in Han Mountain City, and he had seen the gigantic head that Tion's body had stepped on. This person's face was somewhat similar to that head, but if he did not look closely, it would be very easy for others to think that they were 2 different people compared to the head's crazed ferociousness. Su Ming fell silent. In his mind was the image of the second god of berserkers, who had no awe-inspiring might but gave off a cordial feeling. He lifted his left hand and swung it at the sky. The sun, moon, and stars appeared in the sky, displaying divine abilities that shook the sky and earth. He also saw the second god of berserkers sealing another of the three barren arts of heaven, earth, and man into the fan. When he saw the concentration on his face and the kind smile on his face when he created the fan, it was as if he wanted to give the fan to a member of the younger generation. That was not just one fan. There was another fan that had the art of the sun, moon, and stars branded into it by the second god of berserkers. Su Ming also saw it. Once he finished making the two fans, the second god of berserkers walked towards the sky and earth. When a palace appeared before him, a baby's cry came from one of the palaces. The second god of berserkers stood outside the palace from which the baby's cry came from with a smile on his face. At that moment, he no longer looked like a god of berserkers, but more like a normal senior. He was about to push open the door to the palace, as if he wanted to give the two fans to the baby in the palace as his origin treasures. Yet the instant he lifted his left hand and was about to push open the door, the sky suddenly changed and snow started falling. The second god of berserkers froze and pulled back his left hand. His expression instantly turned aloof, and he looked like a completely different person compared to his previous gentle self. He looked toward the sky. The scene changed again. The door to the palace was still open, and the second god of berserkers was covered in blood. The sounds of battle outside reached the sky and earth, and an endless amount of long arcs charged forward, as if a disaster had descended upon the world. The second god of berserkers' face was pale. He walked into the palace and looked at a woman with a similarly pale face standing there gently. The two of them hugged each other. After a long while, the second god of berserkers cast his gaze towards the two small beds in the palace. There were two babies lying on them. One of them was crying, and the other had his eyes closed, unmoving as if he was dead. He moved forward and lifted his left hand to gently touch the crying baby's forehead. Once he did so, he cast a complicated look at the other baby, who looked as if he was dead. He sighed, then moved forward and used his left hand to touch the baby's forehead as well. At the instant his left hand touched the forehead of the seemingly dead baby, Su Ming opened his eyes and started trembling. Everything in the scene, the baby's cry, the second god of berserkers' kind smile, the feeling of touching the baby's forehead, all of this made Su Ming's breathing seem to have stopped. At that moment, he was still absorbing the power from the god of berserkers' arm, but he was forced to open his eyes because the baby's cry gave him a familiar feeling, an incredibly familiar feeling at that moment as his level of cultivation increased as he was touched by that scene, and as he looked at it, a sharp pain shot through his head. In the midst of that pain, cracking sounds rang out, as if something that had originally existed in his head had shattered into pieces. At the same time, a dazed look appeared on his face. He saw a dark world. It was dark, but the area around him was warm. Crying and mumbling reached his ears. It was a woman's voice, and it was very gentle and gentle. "Fair, I'm here. Don't cry. You little girl, you're still so young, and you're already crying so loudly. Looks like when my daughter grows up, she'll definitely be very powerful. All right, I won't take your doll anymore. Here, don't cry, don't cry. Ah, my dear daughter, look, your daddy's back." Su Ming's vision was dark. He could not see light, but he could hear the crying and the woman's gentle voice changing abruptly at that moment. The crying became even more intense, and the gentle voice abruptly fell silent. The area around him instantly turned incredibly cold, as if it was snowing outside. After a long time passed, he felt a hand caressing his forehead. It was very warm, very, very warm. Su Ming snapped out of his daze and sat on the god of berserkers' left hand with a dumbfounded expression. He lowered his head and looked at the god of berserkers' hand beneath him, and tears gradually fell from his eyes. He understood where the warmth he felt when he touched the god of berserkers' left hand came from. Fair. This was the second time Su Ming heard this name, but it was etched into his heart. The illusion-like scenes from before he fought against Di Tian's clone all those years ago appeared once again in Su Ming's heart. Big brother, big brother. That voice surrounded Su Ming's ears, and it gradually fused together with the crying. I'm done. Please don't mind me. I'll explain everything in a few days. Thank you, everyone. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 630. After a long while, Su Ming closed his eyes once again and covered the desolate look in his eyes. In the midst of his loneliness, he sensed the warmth from the second god of Berserker's left hand, and it was just like the feeling of the rough hand caressing his forehead in his memories. It was as if he had returned to the palace from an unknown number of years ago. In that dark world, there was only a small amount of warmth. Perhaps destiny truly existed in this world, Su Ming mumbled. The second god of Berserker's left hand, the caress he had made in the past, the touch he had made today, and all of these things were like a circle. Once he found the beginning, he would also find the end. Perhaps memories are like this as well. Once I find the end, I will also find the beginning. Is this destiny? Su Ming closed his eyes, and anguish appeared on his face. He no longer needed to absorb the power from the god of Berserker's left hand. Instead, once the memories from an unknown number of years ago surfaced in Su Ming's mind, the god of Berserker's left hand surged into his body on its own. The difference between actively absorbing the power and the life force fusing into his body on its own was incredibly great. One of them was a forceful shout, and the other was a shout that came from someone who had obtained acknowledgement and sent it forth with all his might. Time trickled by, and the second god of Berserker's left hand gradually withered and shrank. All the power within was sent into Su Ming's body without reservation, causing all his Berserker bones to start moving towards completion once they reached 9/10 of their original state. It was as if the second god of Berserker's left hand had been waiting for a certain person to arrive, waiting for the baby who had touched his forehead and looked at him with a complicated gaze before he left all those years ago. On the way, perhaps he had mistaken Sima Xian for that baby, but Sima Xian's death and Su Ming's arrival had caused everything to return to its original trajectory. The fan Su Ming had snatched away from Sima Xian had always belonged to him. Destiny, Su Ming. Just what is my destiny? In anguish, Su Ming closed his eyes. The vast life force in his body surged into his body with a bang like an ocean, causing all his flesh, blood, and bones to rapidly change as they absorbed the life force, and he continued moving towards the true great completion of the bone sacrifice realm that no one had ever attained before. Once all his bones, blood, and flesh turned into that of a berserker, then Su Ming's body would be as if he had returned to his ancestors. His strength would surpass his current combat abilities. Time trickled by, and the second god of Berserker's left hand continued withering and shrinking. In the end, it even began to look as if it had become transparent. As for Su Ming, his hair danced in the air, and his chi surged into the sky, but the anguish on his face remained. When they met again, after so many years, the warmth had already become a mere touch. Memories began to awaken bit by bit, making one feel bitter and at a loss. Su Ming was at a loss. What was life? At that moment, he suddenly wanted to know just what was life. In the midst of his confusion, loud booming sounds came from Su Ming's body, and his body instantly turned gold. That gold surpassed the light from the five-direction seal, and it shot through the second god of Berserker's left hand, which was gradually turning transparent. That light came from Su Ming's body. It came from every single bone, every inch of his skin, every single shred of his flesh. It came from his entire body. As the booming sounds reverberated in the air, the golden light from all over Su Ming's body became stronger. He could clearly sense that almost all his bones had turned into berserker bones. Only his skull had not completely turned into a berserker, but it was also rapidly spreading through his body. The speed at which the berserker turned into a berserker was incredibly quick. After some time, golden light shone brilliantly at the center of Su Ming's brows. When a series of faint cracking sounds traveled into the air, his body jolted, and his aura erupted forth at that moment. It increased exponentially at an incredible speed, and after a moment, it reached its peak. That peak was accompanied by the sounds coming from within Su Ming's body. All his bones, his flesh, his blood, and all his veins were completely turned into a berserker at that instant. At the same time, the second god of berserkers' left hand under Su Ming continued turning transparent before disappearing, as if it had completed its mission and what it had been waiting for. At that moment, it returned to dust. As it disappeared and Su Ming opened his eyes, he saw the second god of berserkers' left hand, which had stood tall since ancient times, disappearing. Then, the god of berserkers' left hand turned into glittering light. As they tumbled about, they floated up around Su Ming. Some of the glittering light touched the center of Su Ming's brows, causing him to recall the feeling of the tall figure in the darkness, caressing his forehead with a complicated gaze. Su Ming watched the glittering light floating up quietly, watched them seep through the five-direction seal and disappear into the air, and a feeling of loneliness rose in his heart. After a long while, Su Ming closed his eyes. When he opened them once again, there was only calmness in his eyes. The confusion, loneliness, and anguish were all hidden away. No one could see them, and only he could slowly sense them in his heart. His body floated in midair, still within the five-layered screen of light of the five-direction seal. At that moment, Su Ming stood up slowly, but the instant he did so, he suddenly frowned. He felt as if he was missing something. In silence, Su Ming looked at his hands, then sensed the vast amount of power in his body. This power was much stronger than before, but it only seemed to have increased by a tenth. It did not possess the suppressive power that came with possessing all the berserker bones in his body, as Su Ming had imagined. After all, Su Ming's berserker bones contained the wind berserker's inheritance, the lightning berserker's inheritance, the candle dragon's blessing, the serendipity from blood absconsion tribe's blood, and the second god of berserker's legacy. All of these things were what allowed Su Ming to reach this unprecedented state of cultivation. However, the feeling Su Ming got from this state was not much stronger than before, and it made him feel as if something was off. It was especially so because he could sense that there was even more potential contained within his berserker bones, blood, and flesh, but he could not gather them together. Perhaps I lack a turning point to quickly bring out all the potential in my body. Unless I train and fuse with them for a long period of time, then after some time, I would be able to completely control all my potential. But I don't have enough time. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He had somewhat understood what he lacked. However, this was just his guess. After all, his current state of cultivation had never appeared in the berserker tribe before. He would need to continue exploring and searching for his own path. After remaining silent for a moment, Su Ming's eyes sparkled. The power of his cultivation base started circulating in his body, and his hair started moving without wind. As his cultivation base continued circulating in his body, a rampaging presence filled the area. Since I can't bring out my potential, then I'll force it out. Su Ming's cultivation base circulated faster, but when it spread out from his body, he forcefully pulled it back, causing two different types of pressure to form inside and outside his body. One of them was within his body, and it was forcing his presence outwards, while the other was outside his body, and it was continuously pressing down on him. Because of that, Su Ming's body became the center of the pressure, and his expression became increasingly solemn. If a normal person tried to execute this sort of pressure, then that person would self-destruct. Self-destruction was the collapse of the mighty pressure within the body when it reached a critical point against the pressure from the outside world. The greater the pressure, the more shocking the power of the explosion would be. And when a person self-destructed, all the potential in their body would naturally erupt. This was the method Su Ming had thought of, and it was also a crazy method, because he did not have the time to train in silence and gradually fuse with his potential to bring out his power. That was why he could only use this extreme method to achieve the same result. Only Su Ming could do this, because the tenacity of his body had already reached an incredibly terrifying degree. The drawback of this tenacity was that if Su Ming wanted to self-destruct, the difficulty of doing so would be much greater compared to other people. At that moment, under the pressure from both inside and outside his body, a glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. The circulation of his cultivation base became twice as fast, and because of it, the pressure became much stronger. As it did so, Su Ming sensed that a hint of the potential in his body was finally forced out and fused into his cultivation base. I knew it. Su Ming gritted his teeth and increased the circulation of his cultivation base once again. This time, the increase in his cultivation base practically reached his limit. Booming sounds reverberated in the air, and Su Ming's body trembled. The pressure from both inside and outside his body caused his eyes to become bloodshot, but this action caused a hint of his potential to be forced out once again and fused into his cultivation base. The circulation of his cultivation base became faster, but the potential that was forced out was still not much. I need a turning point. A resolute look appeared on Su Ming's face. He lifted his right hand swiftly and positioned two of his fingers into the shape of a sword. He stared at his fingertips, and without any hesitation, he tapped the center of his brows. At the instant the tip of his finger touched the center of his brows, a sharp pain shot up from the center of his brows. That pain instantly reached its peak, and as if a hole had been pierced through a swollen balloon, a hole appeared in Su Ming's body as he was being squeezed. All his cultivation base erupted with a bang at that instant. The strength of this eruption far surpassed the circulation of Su Ming's cultivation base previously. As it erupted, all the potential in his body was released, and intense pain shot through his body as if he was about to be torn apart. However, in the midst of that pain, Su Ming could truly sense his power. It far surpassed what he had felt previously, and it was a power that truly belonged to those who had turned their entire body into berserker bones. Su Ming lifted his head and let out a roar towards the sky. That roar contained his pain, the strength of his cultivation base, and the will that came from his cultivation base erupting forth at that moment. That roar caused the five-direction seal to tremble, and it shot through the entire seabed, causing the surface of the sea to rumble and stir up huge waves that surged into the sky. In the midst of their shock, all the people on the 9th summit heard Su Ming's roar coming from the depths of the sea. I apologize once again. The update is over. Please forgive me. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 631. As he roared, veins popped up all over Su Ming's body. His expression was ferocious, and fine cracks appeared on his body. Once they spread out and connected with each other, what awaited Su Ming would be even more intense pain. Only when his cultivation base continued erupting from his body and his body exploded would the pain end. Otherwise, the only way was to control this power and make it subside. Su Ming's eyes were bloodshot. At that moment, he no longer let his cultivation base spread outwards. Instead, he pulled it all back into his body, as if he was a wild horse that had broken free of its reins and was now docile. He had already unleashed all of his latent potential, and the boundless power of his cultivation base filled him with both power and madness. Without much hesitation, Su Ming closed his eyes as he sat down. The aura in his body was incredibly chaotic. Sometimes it would be brutal, and at other times it would be gentle. The powerful will he had gathered together in the Candle Dragon's undying and imperishable world was brought into play at that moment. The strength of that will was a tenacity that could not be worn away even after an endless amount of reincarnations, and there was no need to even mention the dangers and pain he had to pay to obtain a powerful level of cultivation. As time passed by, the chaotic aura in Su Ming's body gradually became weaker. He did not know how much time had passed, but when there was no longer any hint of chaos in his body, Su Ming slowly opened his eyes. There were no fluctuations of cultivation base coming from his body. His face was pale, and his body was slender. He looked like an ordinary mortal, and there was no trace of cultivation base at all. Only his eyes were very clear and deep, as if they contained the sun and moon. At that moment, even if a berserker who had attained great completion in the berserker soul realm saw him, it would be difficult for them to tell that Su Ming possessed any power of cultivation if they did not observe him carefully. Because, at that moment, not only had Su Ming turned into a berserker, he had also reached a state of balance. It was as if his life had gone through a metamorphosis, and once he reached perfection, all traces of his transformation were covered up. The reason why powerful berserkers in the bone sacrifice realm were so strong was because their spines had turned into berserkers. It was especially so for those who had attained great completion in the bone sacrifice realm. They could not control the ripples of power in their bodies, and the unique feeling of having their spines turned into berserkers was like a few drops of ink suddenly appearing in transparent water. It was very clear, and people could tell with just one glance that it was different. However, if the transparent water itself was already ink, then in the eyes of outsiders, due to the balance, it would not be much different from water. This sort of state had never appeared since the day the berserkers came into existence. Su Ming was the only person who had experienced it. When he opened his eyes, his pupils were so black that they could be seen clearly. He slowly stood up and did not emit any cultivation. He looked like a mortal as he looked at the 5-direction seal above him. He calmly raised his right hand and waved at the 5 layers of light surrounding the 5-direction seal. There was no earth-shattering rumble as he swung his arm. Instead, the first layer of the seal suddenly shattered inch by inch and collapsed. The seal behind him also suffered the same fate. However, the 5-direction seal was the treasure used to suppress the god of Berserker's left hand. It might have been assimilated by the god of Berserker's left hand over the years, and its sealing power had become much weaker. It no longer possessed the might it had in the past, but it was still not something that could be easily broken. At the instant the first 2 layers of light shattered, the 3 layers of light behind them started flashing, and 2 more layers appeared at a speed visible to the naked eye. Because of that, there were still 5 layers left. Su Ming stood there with a calm expression on his face. His expression did not change much due to the changes in the 5-direction seal. However, his eyes sparkled, as if he was deep in thought. After a moment, a glint appeared in his eyes. He lifted his right hand and pointed at the 5 layers of light. At the instant he did so, the 5 layers of light shuddered with a bang. The first layer crumbled, and the second, third, all the way up to the 5th layer shattered at the same time. However, at the instant they shattered, another 5 layers manifested outside. It was as if there was no end to this seal. It was an eternal seal. I wonder what will happen if this seal is attacked from the outside. Su Ming's eyes sparkled. He saw that as the 5 layers of light expanded outwards, the area within it had also become much larger. By the looks of it, it should be continuously expanding as the 5 layers crumbled. Su Ming took a step forward. As he lifted his right hand, he pointed forward once again. Once he did so, he charged forward like a long arc, and without any hesitation, he pointed forward once more. After a few more times, the 5 layers of light reappeared as they continued shattering. Every single time they reappeared, they would expand outwards by a large margin. Because of that, after a few more times, the outermost layer of light had already expanded to several tens of thousands of feet. As Su Ming continued charging upwards, the outermost layer of light swelled up and spread towards the seawater. Su Ming did not stop moving. With one move, he pointed forward once again with his right hand. The screen of light grew larger. As it shattered and reappeared, it looked like a gigantic bubble that existed in the seawater. It continued spreading outwards and continued floating towards the surface of the sea. After a moment, right before the eyes of all the people on the surface of the sea beyond the 9th summit, as they cried out in shock, they saw loud, booming sounds coming from the surface of the sea in the distance. The seawater looked as if it was tumbling about violently, and As the waves grew endlessly, it looked as if the sea was boiling. A ray of golden light appeared, and as it spread out, a screen of light that looked like a bubble floated up. The instant the screen of light appeared, it caused the dark sky to turn golden, and a mighty pressure that could intimidate hearts spread out in the world. The golden screen of light caused the seawater to roar and tumble backwards in all directions, as if it wanted to avoid it. When the screen of light completely appeared on the surface of the sea like a huge bowl being overturned, an uproar broke out from the ninth summit. All the people who saw it felt their hearts tremble, and their gazes gathered on it. The screen of light continued floating upwards until it left the seawater and appeared in midair. What appeared before all the people's eyes was a circular screen of light. That screen of light shone with a golden light, and there were 5 layers to it. The outermost layer was 100,000 feet big. A person could be seen within the 5th layer, but that person was indistinct, causing all the people to be unable to see his face clearly. The 100,000 feet circular screen of light in the dark sky made the golden light look like a sun. It would make all the people who saw it feel their hearts tremble, and at the same time, an endless amount of respect would rise in their hearts. Use your full strength and attack that screen of light. At the same time, the people from Heaven Gate who were taking refuge in the ninth summit were shocked by Su Ming's appearance. Su Ming's voice traveled forth with a buzzing sound from the screen of light and echoed in all directions. Su Ming! It's Su Ming! When the people from Heaven Gate who were taking refuge in the ninth summit heard this voice, they immediately became excited. To them, Su Ming was not their enemy, but their benefactor who had saved them from Sima Xian. Even if Heaven Gate had killed many people, the culprit behind all of this was not Su Ming, but Sima Xian. It was especially so for those who had known Su Ming since a long time ago. When they saw this scene and heard his voice, a slightly complicated look appeared on their faces, and an even deeper wave of emotions rose within them. Bai Su looked at Su Ming, and in her daze, tears fell from her eyes. However, there was joy contained within those tears, along with a hint of complicated emotions. It was a sigh that rose within her once she remembered what had happened in the past. Her father, the old man, looked at Su Ming in the 5-layered screen of light in the sky, quietly. Even now, he still could not connect this person before him with the young man from all those years ago. Attack this screen of light with all your might. I want to test the might of this screen of light. Su Ming's voice traveled forth once again from within the screen of light. After a period of silence, some people immediately flew up from the crowd and charged towards the screen of light. Soon after, more people flew up, and long arcs shot through the sky. As they charged forth, booming sounds reverberated in the air, and the people in the long arcs brought forth their full strength to attack the 5-layered screen of light according to Su Ming's orders. However, the screen of light only swayed slightly. It did not show any signs of crumbling. That's enough. Su Ming's voice traveled forth, and the people around him immediately moved back with respectful expressions. This thing might be a seal, but if I use it well, it can also turn into a protective treasure. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He lifted his right hand and pressed it against his chest. Immediately, a ray of dark light flew out of his mouth, and, as it shone, it turned into the welcoming of deities in Su Ming's hand. That pill was black. Even though Su Ming had brought it out, his presence did not change in the slightest. He no longer needed to use the welcoming of deities to obtain the god of Berserker's divine abilities. He had already obtained everything when he absorbed the god of Berserker's left hand. Once he put away the welcoming of deities, Su Ming looked at the 5-direction seal that had yet to disappear. With a calm expression, he spread his divine sense outwards and fused it into the black stone fragment on his neck that he had not used for a long time. That stone fragment could deceive all existences, and the 5-direction seal was naturally nothing to it. This was one of the reasons why Su Ming dared to take the risk to search for serendipities in the 5-direction seal. Almost the instant Su Ming's divine sense touched the black stone fragment, his presence changed abruptly. Gradually, the presence that belonged to the second god of berserkers could no longer be found on him. As if he had turned into a different person, Su Ming walked towards the five-layered screen of light before him. The instant he touched the inner layer of the screen of light, there was not a single hint of obstruction on his body. He walked out, and when he stood in midair, he turned around and looked at the five-layered screen of light. Once Su Ming left, the screen of light gradually shrank, as if it could not find the source of the seal. Eventually, with a flash of golden light, it turned into a golden five-direction seal the size of a palm. That seal floated in midair and fell towards the sea, but with a swing of Su Ming's arm, the five-direction seal flew towards him. He held it in his hand and scrutinized it for a few moments. Once he put away, he turned his head around and cast his gaze on the people around him and the ninth summit. Close-quarters combat is fierce. My opponent's blades are coming at me, but I'm outside and can only defend. Once I get back, I will definitely counterattack. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 632. Greetings, Sir Su Ming. Greetings, Sir Su Ming. Before Su Ming were the people who had attacked the screen of light due to his request. At that moment, they were all looking at him with respect on their faces. Some of them had seen Su Ming in the past, and their hearts were filled with complicated emotions at that moment, but they did not dare show any of it on their faces. Instead, they were incredibly respectful. It did not matter which race they belonged to, the powerful would always be respected. This respect might be sincere, but might also be due to fear. The powerful were revered, and this was the law of heaven that would never change. This group of people before Su Ming's eyes were like that. They were the survivors of Heaven Gate's destruction, and they had personally witnessed Su Ming's slaughter in Heaven Gate. As they spoke, Su Ming's gaze fell on them, and they lowered their heads, not daring to look him in the eye. Su Ming's gaze was not too fierce in their eyes. Instead, it was clear and profound. But that ordinary gaze made these people feel as if their hearts had been seen through with just one glance, and they had a feeling that they could not hide anything from Su Ming. The shock in their hearts filled these people's hearts at that moment. As they lowered their heads, Su Ming looked at them. There were some among these people whom he had some vague memories of, but he could not remember their names. They were people he had met by chance when he was in the ninth summit. After all, to those who knew Su Ming, 20-something years had passed. Perhaps many things could be changed in 20 years, but to those who possessed power, their memories would not be too vague. However, Su Ming had gone through the Candle Dragon's countless cycles of reincarnation in the undying and imperishable world. His will might have become stronger, but besides some special people and some special events, his memories of the past had all become blurry, as if he had been separated from the past. In fact, even the feelings he had for Su Ming in the past had become much fainter. It was as if he had swept his gaze past the people in midair and landed on the ninth summit, on the beautiful figure dressed in white, just like she had been in the past. Huzi's snores were still occasionally echoing in the air, breaking the silence that had descended upon the area due to Su Ming's appearance. Su Ming lifted his foot and took a step towards the ninth summit. When his foot landed, he disappeared and reappeared in the sky above the ninth summit. When he took a step forward, he stood at the top of the mountain. Aside from Baisu and her father, there were also a few people who had escaped from the Heaven Gate on the mountain peak. Among them was a white-robed old man. He was the Heaven Gate master who had lost consciousness and looked like he was dead. After Ma Xian died, the berserker threads in the old man's body did not disappear. They did not get close to the place, but occasionally some of them would lift their heads and naturally look towards the figure under the moonlight at the top of the mountain. When they looked at him, gratitude and respect would appear in their eyes. Baisu sat by Su Ming's side. The two of them had been there for almost 2 hours. They did not speak as they watched the sky gradually turn dark and the sea and sky dim. In truth, they were not the only ones there. There was a bald crane lying at the edge of the cliff, not too far away. It was lying there in a lackadaisical manner, and in its claws was a shiny stone. It continued looking at it, and occasionally a smug smile would appear on its lips, and it would let out cackling sounds. "Will you still leave?" After a long while, the bald crane shifted its gaze away from the crystal and cast a few glances at Su Ming and Bai Su. At that moment, Bai Su broke the silence. "I'll go to Eastern Wastelands," Su Ming said languidly as he looked at the black seawater. "I wish you happiness." Bai Su lowered her head and looked at the seawater as well, speaking softly. Su Ming did not speak. He turned his head around and looked at Bai Su. Her hair was very long, and it covered her face, covered Su Ming's gaze, and also covered the hideous scar on her face. "I was ignorant in the past. Thank you for your tolerance. I'm very happy to be able to see you this time," Bai Su said softly. She did not look at Su Ming, but instead lowered her head and looked at the sea. A gentle smile appeared on her face, and there was a hint of carefreeness in that smile, along with a hint of nostalgia. After a long while, she stood up and walked past Su Ming. "The 9th summit is your home. Leave in peace. I will stay here and take care of this place. If I'm no longer here one day, my corpse will also be here to atone for the harm I did to you in the past," Bai Su said softly. Bai Su spoke softly. The instant she walked past Su Ming, he suddenly lifted his hand and grabbed her arm. The instant his hand touched Bai Su, she shuddered lightly. She did not try to break free and simply allowed Su Ming to hold her arm, but she still kept her head lowered. Su Ming stood up and looked at Bai Su. He lifted his right hand and pushed aside some of the black hair on her face. Bai Su clearly avoided his touch, but Su Ming still saw the hideous scar on her face. Bai Su closed her eyes, and tears fell from the corners of her eyes. She lowered her head, as if she did not want Su Ming to see that hideous scar. "You don't need to atone for your sins. What happened in the past is already in the past. What I want to see is the cute girl from before, the girl with wild beauty," Su Ming said softly as he looked at Bai Su. "People grow up, don't they? I'm no longer the person I was in the past, and neither are you." Bai Su opened her eyes and looked at Su Ming. The wild look in her eyes was no longer there, but had been replaced by the signs of age and time. There was also a deep wave of exhaustion and a powerlessness to fight against fate. "My father once said that I am the life of a stone falling from the river in the sky. That stone falling into the river stirred up waves and turned into me. I am destined to be accompanied by tears for the rest of my life. I am destined to forever be the splashes from the river." Bai Su looked at Su Ming and struggled with her right hand, as if she wanted to break free from his grip. "When I come back, I will search for a way to return to the alliance of the Western region. If I find it, then come with me to the alliance of the Western region." Su Ming did not let go. He looked at Bai Su, at the woman, and spoke languidly. "The stone falling from the river in the sky is destined to be alone for the rest of my life because of that stone. Even if it falls into the river, no one will be able to find it because there's a lot of water in the river in the sky, and I am just a few drops of it. Su Ming, I will stay here. I will help you take care of the 9th summit, but I won't leave with you." Bai Su turned her head around and broke free from Su Ming's grip. When she turned her head back, her black hair danced in the air and cut off a few of her tears, causing them to shatter and fly into the air. They floated past Su Ming's eyes, and Bai Su left into the distance. Su Ming watched Bai Su disappear from his sight quietly. Dark Mountains by Ling and a celestial maiden from the world of 9 appeared before his eyes. The figures of these 3 women seemed to have overlapped with each other at that moment. The fate of falling rocks in the Milky Way appears because of the falling rocks. Because of the falling rocks, it is unique, and because of the falling rocks, it is lonely. In the end, it fuses with the river, making it impossible for anyone to find it. An old voice traveled forth from the other side of the mountain. Along with that voice was an old man with a pale face and a complicated look on his face. That old man's life force was dim, as if there was not much left in him. It was as if all signs of his life could be wiped away at any moment. He walked towards Su Ming. He was Bai Su's father, the middle-aged man who was famous in Heaven Gate all those years ago. 20 years had passed, and time had left too many marks on his body. This is her fate. If she can't break it, then she's destined to be like this. Begging for votes, begging for defense. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 633. What is life? Su Ming asked calmly as he looked at the black sky and sea in the distance. The footsteps grew closer, and by Su's father, the old man with an ancient face, stopped several dozens of feet away from Su Ming. He looked at the sky and see Su Ming was looking at. That place was completely dark. Bai Su's father remained silent for a moment before he said hoarsely, "All things in the world have life. This life is not born, but born from what we sensed in our previous lives and what we gained in our current lives." Bai Su's father remained silent for a moment before he said hoarsely, "How did you determine that the stone falling from the river in the sky is Bai Su's life?" Su Ming still did not look at Bai Su's father as he asked flatly, "Because the blood of the Bai family is the life of the river in the sky. We live our lives in sorrow and loneliness, and only our children remain with us until we grow old. The river in the sky is formed by starlight. There are many of them, and when they fuse together, they may seem clear at first glance, but if you look closely, you won't be able to tell them apart. It's the same for me, and it's the same for my younger brother, Bai Changzai. My daughter, Bai Su, also has this life. Every generation of the Bai family has this life. But Bai Su is slightly different. Her life was changed because of the stone falling from the sky. That stone is Sima, and it's you," Bai Su's father said slowly. His voice was low, and it reverberated in the dark. "Nonsense." Su Ming turned his head around and cast Bai Su's father a cold glance. Sima's life is a life that can be refracted by dew. The person with this life is the light of the dew on the grass, and when the sun rises, it refracts light. He was originally a grass, but because of the dew on him, he shines so brilliantly under the sun. This is borrowing life. I don't know what his life is, but the reason why he has such great power and serendipity is because of the effect of the dew refracting light. Refracting light can be broken or reversed. That's why I came to the conclusion that if this person dies, he will definitely die because of the refraction. The person who can kill him is definitely the person who gave him the dew and lent him his life. Bai Su's father's eyes were originally dull and lifeless, but as he spoke, his eyes sparkled brightly, and he looked at Su Ming as if he had regained consciousness before his death. "As for your fate, I've divined it in the past. It's the life of plants, trees, and stones. Plants, trees, and stones contain veins that can support your entire body. Those who have this life will be controlled by others like puppets, unable to break free. But now that I see your life again, it has gone through a drastic change. I can't see your life on you." Bai Su's father looked at Su Ming and took a few steps forward, his voice becoming urgent. "That's impossible. Everything in the world has a life. Even those who die will have their lives and will not disappear, but you." Bai Su's father stared at Su Ming, and a brilliant light appeared in his eyes. Su Ming looked at the old man before him coldly. The matter of life the old man mentioned seemed to be related to his epiphany towards life cultivation, but it was even more vague, making it hard for others to believe in it. Besides, life cultivation was a new realm in the Berserker tribe after the Berserker soul realm. Perhaps there were truly people who could step into this realm, but they were incredibly rare. Even those who could figure out its threshold were few in number. Su Ming did not believe that the old man before him was someone who had figured out the threshold of life cultivation, or else there would be no way he would have been bullied by Sima Xian. However, while Su Ming did not believe in the old man's words, the meaning contained within them made Su Ming's heart tremble. When Sima Xian died, he turned into a puppet. The hair I had when I was a baby, and that drop of blood was at the center of the puppet's brows. I also saw the altars on the continents because of that hair. The brilliance of dew. Su Ming's expression was unreadable. He looked at the old man, and his gaze was still as aloof as ever. I know that you won't believe in this so-called art of life so easily, but everything I said is true. Bai Su's father spoke once again. In Su Ming's head, the life that belonged to him, especially the first half of his life of plants, stones, and plants. He was being controlled like a puppet, and this caused Su Ming's pupils to shrink in a barely noticeable manner. Then what is your own life? My life. There was a hint of anguish on Bai Su's father's face, but when he looked at Su Ming, there was a hint of surprise within that anguish. My life is the life of the fish in the sky. This life cannot be empty. Once it is, then I will definitely die. I'm like a fish that has left the water. I won't be able to live for long. I did not understand it until I saw you again. You don't have a life. You are empty. Bai Su's father looked at Su Ming and spoke with a complicated expression. So you're saying that you won't be able to live for long? Su Ming asked languidly with a calm expression. I'll die in at most a few days, or at least a few moments. Bai Su's father sighed and spoke in a low voice. Su Ming narrowed his eyes and suddenly asked, how can you see other people's lives? About that, Bai Su's father hesitated for a moment. He cast Su Ming a glance and gritted his teeth. The Bai family has a long history in Freezing Sky Clan. Our ancestor, Bai Yuan Hua, was one of the founders of Freezing Sky Clan. His power could be said to have shaken the land of South Morning during that era. We don't know where he is now. Once he built Freezing Sky Clan, he left the land of South Morning, but before he left, he isolated himself for 100 years. When he left behind a life scroll. That life scroll is broken. Our ancestor obtained it by chance. He left to search for the other life scrolls. In fact, his great power also came from the epiphany he gained from this life scroll. But the descendants of the Bai family do not have our ancestors' intelligence. Even now, there is no one who has completely understood the life scroll. Since we are worried that we will get into trouble because of our wealth, we've kept this a secret of the Bai family. My younger brother, Bai Chongzai, had the most epiphany, but he was still unable to gain a deep understanding of it. As for me, I only know the surface of it. I can only make some deductions and calculations. That's all. Bai Su's father's face was filled with sincerity. His voice echoed in the dark night, causing all those who heard it to feel as if he was an ancient being. This is absolutely true. There is no need for me to lie to you. I can give you this life scroll that has been passed down in the Bai family, but I only ask of you one thing. When Bai Su's father said those words, he lifted his right hand swiftly and tapped the center of his brows with a finger. Immediately, a dark light shone at the spot where his finger touched, and his body immediately started trembling before he started withering away. As he withered away, the skin on his face started squirming, as if there was something moving within his body. Bai Su's father sucked in a deep breath and lifted his left hand to swing in the air. Immediately, a lit incense appeared before him. Wisps of smoke surrounded the incense, and, as it floated up, Bai Su's father sucked in a deep breath. Instantly, the smoke turned into 7 wisps that crawled into his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. This scene was incredibly bizarre, and it made Su Ming's gaze focus on it. Once Bai Su's father absorbed the 7 wisps of smoke, his body trembled, and a crack appeared at the center of his brows. No blood flowed out from that crack, as if it had been there for many years, but it was usually hidden so that no one could see it. A person had to use a unique secret art to make it appear on their body, and the instant the crack appeared, Su Ming immediately sensed a presence that made his heart tremble, spreading out from within the crack. This aura was difficult to describe. It was like a sweet fragrance, causing one to feel a sense of joy in their body and mind. It was as if their entire body had relaxed, and even their cultivation base seemed to have increased a bit. In the depths of their hearts, joy appeared, as if they had experienced something extremely joyous, causing a smile to appear on their faces uncontrollably. It made them try to sense the presence of that presence, but when they could not help but open up their hearts and touch that presence was no longer sweet, but had turned into a nauseating feeling. It was a nauseating feeling that made them feel as if they wanted to vomit out all their organs. It was as if everything they had sensed previously was just an illusion, and what they felt right now was the real thing. However, if that was all, then that presence would not have been too bizarre. What made Su Ming's heart tremble was that after he felt nauseous, he slowly sensed bitterness from that presence. That bitterness was as if he had swallowed the thickest gallbladder in the world, and it made him feel extreme bitterness from within his body. That complicated and ever-changing presence made Su Ming's heart tremble. At the same time, he saw Bai Su's father lifting his right hand and reaching into the crack at the center of his brows. His expression was strange, as if he was laughing and crying at the same time. Slowly, he pulled out a black piece of wood. That piece of wood was only the width of 2 fingers and about half a palm long. The presence that made Su Ming's heart tremble came from that piece of wood. This is the life scroll left behind by our ancestor before he left all those years ago. This scroll is not a scroll, and its art is to turn wood into wood. Su Ming's eyes were trained on that black piece of wood. The instant his gaze was fixed on that piece of wood, he felt as if he could hear the cries of babies, the cries of women, the sorrowful cries of men, and the sounds of old people's tears falling on their robes. Those were the cries of people living through different periods of time. Su Ming's pupils shrank. With his current level of cultivation, it was rare for his expression to change. But at that moment, he was moved, and it was all because of that small piece of wood. This item is definitely not ordinary. This was the only thought that appeared in Su Ming's head at that moment. Because while Su Ming could hear crying from that piece of wood, he could only see illusionary shadows surrounding that piece of wood. Those shadows were of a man and a woman, and they were laughing. They were laughing in all sorts of ways. They were laughing at birthdays, at the birth of a child, at the ceremony of marriage, at the consummation of marriage, at all sorts of things, at all sorts of lives, and at all sorts of joyful smiles. I'll give this to you. I only ask one thing of you. Promise me that if one day you possess the power to change the principles of life, then help my daughter, Bai Su, change her life. Before you possess this power, I hope that she can live peacefully in this chaotic world. Bai Su's father sat down cross-legged on the ground. His voice was weak, and once he said those words, he swung his right hand. Immediately, that black piece of wood slowly floated towards Su Ming. It floated right before Su Ming. Su Ming looked at that piece of wood, and after a long while, he nodded slowly. He might have some guesses about what Bai Su's father had said about the art of life, but he still chose to agree to the old man's request. The instant Su Ming nodded, a smile appeared on Bai Su's father's face. He lifted his head and looked at the black sky and sea in the distance. Vaguely, he seemed to see a woman walking out of the air and extending her hand towards him. Hui Chun, is that you? Bai Su's father had a dazed look on his face. He spoke softly and closed his eyes. His presence and life force disappeared at that instant. When I received the double monthly votes, I said that I would go out twice this month. The first time was on the 12th, and the second time was on the 19th. Many in the circle of authors knew about this, and quite a number of them went out as well. For example, right now, I'm riding together with the old cat, who is just as miserable as I am, and we're scolding someone together. I'm anxious, and I want to explode. This is the truth. The original plan was for everyone to go back together on the 22nd, but now I'm going home tomorrow. For today and tomorrow, please allow me to write one chapter each day. Once I go home on the 22nd, I will immediately explode. This is an oath. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 634. The black wooden block floated before Su Ming and let out a dark light. Su Ming's gaze fell on Bai Su's father's body, and as he looked at his lifeless body, a dazed smile appeared on his face. Su Ming was originally not someone who would believe in anything easily, but at that moment, Bai Su's father's words appeared in his head. As he looked at his dead body, all of this made him doubt life arts. Life! Su Ming closed his eyes, and when he opened them after some time, he looked at the black wooden block before him. He lifted his right hand swiftly and seized the wooden block. A strange light appeared in his eyes. The instant he touched the wooden block, Su Ming felt as if he could vaguely see all manner of lives growing old, falling sick, and dying before his eyes. The unfamiliar faces and unfamiliar voices eventually turned into a gigantic, smiling face. However, there were tears falling from that smiling face, and it swiftly charged towards Su Ming, causing his heart to tremble. At the same time, the dazed state before his eyes disappeared, and everything returned to normal. Bai Su's father's corpse was still sitting there. It was still dark around him, and the occasional sound of the waves from the sea in the distance fused together with the relative silence. However, Su Ming could not calm his heart, because in the depths of his heart, the muffled voice that echoed in the air the instant the tearful, smiling face rushed towards him. What is life? This was a question. That voice did not sound like it was asking someone else, but was asking itself as it gained some sort of epiphany. Due to that unique ripple, that epiphany filled the black wooden block, and it was precisely because of that epiphany that gathered together that the black wooden block became extraordinary. This was a question Su Ming had asked himself when he possessed a hint of life cultivation's presence. However, at that time, he had asked himself that question with uncertainty and bewilderment. Right now, the muffled voice that came from the black wooden block was a question that contained a hint of nostalgia and a hint of sentimentality after it had gained an epiphany. The words were the same, but the meaning was incredibly different. Su Ming opened his mouth, but he forgot the answer. He could not answer the question, because he was even more lost. What is life? Su Ming fell silent. He suddenly felt that the epiphany that had appeared in some of his previous thoughts seemed a little insignificant now. The three words that came out of the black wooden block seemed to be a question to itself. But in truth, the feeling that existed within those three words was clearly an expression of comprehension. The ancestor of the Bai family practiced cultivation because of a life scroll, and he gained a deep understanding towards it, allowing him to understand the heavenly art of life. Perhaps all of this is because of these three words. Su Ming closed his eyes, and the words life continuously appeared in his head. These three words were filled with the vicissitudes of time, and they contained boundless wisdom and emotion. Anyone who heard them would feel their hearts sink into a trance, and even their consciousness would sink into it. Su Ming sat on a mountain rock with his eyes closed. As the voice echoed in his head, he did not want to wake up. Time passed slowly. When the morning of the second day arrived, the thick clouds in the distance began to emit a halo of light, causing the sea and the sky to become slightly brighter. The surrounding darkness was slowly covered up. Su Ming did not wake up. He continued sitting there, trying to understand and think quietly, forgetting about the passage of time. Zi finally woke up 3 days later. He yawned, looking as if he was still slightly sleepy. When he opened his eyes and saw the bald crane, he was momentarily stunned before he fell into a daze. The bald crane was also looking at Zi at that moment. The man and crane stared at each other for some time, and the bald crane suddenly noticed that the man before it seemed to be a little silly. Hence, a thought appeared in its head, and with a solemn expression, it spoke languidly. "You've finally woken up. I've been waiting for you for many years. Do you know just how much effort I've spent to make you wake up, boy?" The bald crane's voice was languid, and there was an awe-inspiring tone to it. Yet almost at the moment that awe-inspiring tone appeared, Zi glared at it and lifted his hand to slap the bald crane. That slap was incredibly sudden, and the bald crane did not notice it at all. It was even confused by Zi's expression. When that slap landed on its face, its entire body was instantly swept up by a huge force and sent flying to the side. "Darn it all, I'm the smartest person in the 9th summit. How dare you try to fool me?" Zi glared at it and rolled up his sleeves, stood up, and roared at the bald crane. "I was wondering why I kept feeling as if someone was tickling me when I was sleeping. So it's you bald crane. I'm going to strangle you to death." As Zi spoke, he flew into a rage, and took huge strides towards the bald crane, who had nearly been dazed by the slap. When the bald crane saw Huzi walking towards it in anger, it immediately screeched and flew into a rage. The few feathers on its body all stood up at that moment, and it even flapped its wings a few times. "Ah, how dare you treat me like this, boy? If you don't give me 10,000 crystals, then even if that boy Sue is around, I will still not let you off." As it spoke, the bald crane flapped its wings like a chick. By the looks of it, it did not want to get close to Huzi, but wanted to leave the cave abode. Huzi's expression was one of disdain. When he lifted his right hand, a crystal immediately appeared on his palm, and he threw it towards the ground. The sound of the crystal falling on the ground was incredibly clear. The bald crane was retreating, and when it heard that sound, it almost instinctively pounced on the crystal on the ground. There was not a hint of hesitation in this action, and it was a completely instinctive action. Yet the instant it pounced on the crystal, Huzi had already lifted his right fist and rammed it into the bald crane's body. "You little brat, I've been doing this since I was 3 years old. How dare you try to play tricks on me?" Ignoring Huzi and the bald crane for the time being, Bai Su calmly took away her father's corpse on the third day after Su Ming immersed himself in his attempt to gain his epiphany. She seemed to have known that this would happen, and there was no surprise on her face. However, there was grief on her face and tears that she could not hide no matter what. Some of the people who sought refuge in the ninth summit chose to leave in the following days. Before they left, they cast a glance towards the spot where Su Ming had isolated himself to meditate, and with respect in their hearts, they left the ninth summit to search for their homes that might have been submerged or might still exist. The berserker threads on these people's bodies did not disappear. Instead, once they lost their lives, they remained deep within their bodies, and as they left, they were taken away. The people who chose to continue staying in the ninth summit were led by the old man in white, the Lord of Heaven Gate. They stayed quietly at the center of the ninth summit. They no longer had a home, and neither did they know where they should go. This place was their only home. Once Huzi understood what had happened in Heaven Gate over the past few days, the shock in his heart turned into a silly grin, and eventually, it turned into a smug look. The ninth summit belonged to Su Ming and Huzi. In this place, he was the master, and the others were just guests. Due to Su Ming's existence, all the people who chose to stay in the ninth summit were incredibly polite to Huzi and did not dare offend him. Even the Lord of Heaven Gate, the old man in white, was the same. As for the bald crane, it glared at Huzi all day long, but every single time it saw Huzi toss out a crystal, it would immediately smile and charge towards the crystal. However, there was one time when Huzi tossed out a crystal he had researched many years ago. It looked like a crystal, and its presence was also incredibly similar, but it was not a crystal. Instead, it was a stone that had been solidified from waste crystal powder. The bald crane pounced on it, as usual. In fact, it did not even notice it, and Huzi despised the bald crane in his heart. What an idiot! I'm still the smarter one. Do you really think that I don't know what a fake crystal is? But even if it's a fake crystal, I can still use it to fool others. Why wouldn't I want it? Just like that, the man and the crane played around happily on the ninth summit as Su Ming immersed himself in trying to gain his epiphany. Besides Huzi, there was another transcendent existence on the ninth summit, and that was Bai Su. The matter between Bai Su and Su Ming was not a secret in Heaven Gate all those years ago. Quite a number of people had seen through it, and in many people's eyes, he could be considered as half the master of the ninth summit. Time passed by. When a month went by, Su Ming still did not wake up. He was still immersed in his epiphany, lingering on the tone contained within the words life. He was trying to find the person who had said those 3 words in the past and branded them on the black wooden piece of life scroll. He wanted to know what sort of epiphany had caused him to say those words with a myriad of emotions in his heart. The ancestor of the Bai family had also walked down Su Ming's current path. With his continuous epiphany, he had obtained that powerful level of cultivation and became one of the founders of Freezing Sky Clan. At that moment, Su Ming had also taken his first step down this path. However, the epiphany varied from person to person. It was the same sentence and the same tone, but different people would gain different things when they tried to understand it. As Su Ming immersed himself in his epiphany, as the other people who chose to stay in the ninth summit remained calm, as Zi played with the bald crane, and as Bai Su stood quietly at the top of the mountain with her black hair lifted by the wind to reveal her beautiful figure. This quiet scene happened beyond the protective screen of light at the edge of the gigantic island where Freezing Sky Clan was located. The Dead Sea roared and raging waves surged about. Hundreds of gigantic heads popped up from the surface of the sea, and their eyes shone with an aloof, dark light. They stared at the protective screen of light and continued closing in. Further in the distance, as the surface of the sea tumbled about, aquatic dragons could be seen occasionally revealing their gigantic bodies. As their roars reverberated in the air, at the furthest spot on the Dead Sea, a gigantic ship that was 100,000 feet long appeared. Standing at the bow of that ship was a tall and slender figure. His face could not be seen clearly, but his merciless and arrogant eyes could be seen. As they shone, they were like dazzling stars. There was a woman accompanying him. That woman's hair danced in the sea breeze, and she looked incredibly elegant. The woman looked at the island behind the protective screen of light and asked softly, "Big Brother Bailing, is this Freezing Sky Clan of the Berserkers' land of South Morning?" I rushed home through the night on the highway. I estimated that I would only reach home around 11 at night. I'm in the service area right now. My phone has 3G signal, so I'll update this chapter. I'll explode tomorrow. Thank you, Union Head. Thank you, my fellow Taoists. Thank you for your understanding. I won't disappoint you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.